Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I want to start a new series. What if Deku had an overpowered twin classmates? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
The between, where all souls go after their fleshy vessels die, was traversed by a soul. The souls had no emotion since they lacked flesh. Not a sight, not a sound, no odor, don't touch. Their only option is to float while reflecting on their lives and anticipating what will happen next. Souls came and went from the between all the time. The sudden appearance of a screen full of writing interrupted the musings of a soul that had been drifting in the between for an indeterminate period of time. For some time, the soul was horribly perplexed. It couldn't help but wonder how it was seeing something without eyes since it hadn't seen anything since it died. It read the message after realizing that the why was completely irrelevant. Hello, your reincarnation is about to happen. Your reward has been determined after your karma has been assessed. It is determined that your karmic value is above average. Reincarnation into a random reality you like and are familiar with is your reward. Your rewards have changed as a result of the structural reality of the selected dimension. They have selected your new reality. The reality is known to you as My Hero Academia. Because quirks are genetic, you can choose the family you were born into to increase your chances of developing the powerful quirk you want. Your selection will be considered when your quirk is created and enhanced after your family has been selected. Finally, until you take back control of your life, you will be shielded from threats. You can also pick a random family. Your quirk will be entirely random if you select this option, but it will be further improved to give it more strength, flexibility, or other features. Until you take back control of your life, you will continue to be protected. Hours before canon starts, you will be inserted. Make your decision, please. The soul needed time to digest what it had read. Why am I being reincarnated? Isn't this something that's supposed to happen in fanfiction and to either random or really good people? Was the first question that came to mind. Inaccurate. After the death of their physical body, all souls reincarnate into their own universe. Human minds are genuinely incapable of understanding the idea of an infinite universe. Everything is possible, but My Hero Academia is just some anime. It's not real. Inaccurate. Alternate realities are introduced into fictional worlds in a variety of ways. They only existed in your reality because the soul that reincarnated there anticipated their existence. People who have lived them introduce many fictional worlds into reality by drawing on their experiences and knowledge from their past lives. These stories gradually spread into different realities and are told to more souls. Are you saying my whole reality was just some reincarnator's new reality? That's right. For a reincarnated soul to be inserted, new realities are constructed, selected, and ready. New souls are created through this process, and they will live, die, and reincarnate to create even more new souls. It doesn't matter what you do in the reality you enter. The decisions you make will determine how long you live in your next life. The soul needed some time to absorb the earth-shattering information that had just been presented to it. It would break the mind of the poor being if it knew how frequently other souls were in the same situation. Other souls were feeling the same way at that precise moment. So my choices are to pick a family I know, such as the Midoriyas, or a random family. The soul asked after it had recovered. Agreed. Could I pick the Shigaraki family? Yes. The soul gave that some serious thought. He would have a lot of protection and possible power if he were a member of All for One's family. If he didn't steal whatever quirk the soul acquired, there would be nothing stopping the guy from transforming him into a Nomu the day his protection ended. On the downside, All for One was utterly insane. Nevertheless, it was very tempting to consider obtaining a copy of the All for One quirk. Other forms of power also needed to be taken into account. Although his quirk would be random, it appeared that it would be more likely to be something he knew or had to do with the family he chose. With little chance of it being similar to Shoto's quirk and combining both, the Todoroki family most likely intended either an ice or fire quirk. Furthermore, if he was even half as horrible a child abuser as he appeared to be on the show, he would probably kill Endeavor the moment he gained control of his body. No, he was thinking of another filthy rich family that gave birth to a child with genuinely limitless potential. If I choose the Yaoyorozu family, would I be Momo's older or younger brother? The age difference would only be a few hours. It's random whether you would be younger or older. If I chose the Yaoyorozu family I would be Momo's twin brother. Agreed. If I understand right, That means the odds of me not only getting the creation quirk would be better, but if I did get it, it would be further strengthened. Agreed. I choose the Yaoyorozu family. A decision was made and approved. Quirks calculation. Designated as a quirk. Biokinesis, also known as biological manipulation, self-major, others minor, is a quirk. The capacity to control life and living things is a quirk. After reincarnation, more details will be revealed. The beginning of reincarnation. Yaoyorozu Kenichi awoke with a start. He glanced around the enormous bedroom in the enormous complex that was the Yaoyorozu family mansion, which was entirely his. He didn't feel lost or perplexed about what was going on or where he was. His alarm had gone off, and he would soon be leaving for school. Kenichi was a little taken aback to discover that he was still in his final year of middle school. It took him a moment to realize that, in theory, the My Hero Academia canon story started about 10 months prior to the UA entrance exam. High school. Accordingly, Midoriya Izuku ought to meet All Might today and be selected as All Might's heir. For a moment, Kenichi thought about stealing Izuku's One for All power, but he soon saw that it would be very difficult. His absence from school was unavoidable. If he did, he would suffer severe mental harm from the look his cute little sister would give him. In addition, he felt no need to use One for All's meager power because he now had a better understanding of his quirk. Yes, his knowledge of his quirk allowed him to realize that, with a little work, he could easily become as strong as Izuku, if not stronger, and gain a lot more skills and adaptability to help in any circumstance. Every single atom in his body was completely and totally under his control. He could alter his genetic code in any way he pleased and endow himself with any desired characteristic. Hell, he could even replicate human and animal characteristics using a tiny amount of their genetic material. Luke Cage's unbreakable skin made of abalone. Simple. Is it possible to replicate all of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man's physical prowess, including genetic web shooters? Yes. Quick recovery? Yes. Growing back missing limbs? Simple. Immortality by biology? He would only ever reach the age he desired. His new favorite science was biomimetics. He was free to take any and all good evolutionary traits. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Above all, his skills required a lot of energy. He was fortunate to have the same capacity to consume large quantities of food and store the extra energy in his fat cells. Additionally, he could reabsorb any short-term changes and recover the majority of the energy expended. For instance, adopting a prototype persona and transforming his arms into enormous, fleshy swords before returning them to their original form. In the process, he would lose some energy, but not nearly as much as Momo would when creating something. Second, some of the changes are really painful. He could calm himself if he had time ahead of him, but it would be extremely painful if he had to make a last-minute change. It was not a gentle process to tear apart and rearrange cells. Nevertheless, his quirk was fantastic in spite of everything. Hell, he might even use it to influence others. But there wasn't much he could do to them. Healing people is the greatest thing he could do. He could replace damaged or lost cells and create cells that were exactly like the person he was healing by using his own energy reserves. He made replacement parts and installed them instead of actually healing them. He could even replace missing limbs if that were the case. He could also alter someone's genetic makeup. But it would take a long time for the changes to properly spread. The patient may then need to wait even longer to see improvements. For instance, he could genetically alter Ashido Mina's skin and hair color. She would have to wait for her skin to naturally shed and for her hair to grow out before she could even notice the genetic changes, which would take weeks to months to spread. However, he was able to treat genetic illnesses in this way, which was extremely valuable. Cancer. Cure. PFFT. He was going to become an absurdly well-liked hero. All he would need to do is exercise caution. People might be erratic and turn against him if they thought he wasn't recovering quickly enough or something. For now, he would have to keep that detail a secret. To cure his cancer, he would simply need to create a small genetic beastie. The knock on the door and the elderly male voice asking, "Kenichi-sama, are you dressed?" startled him out of his reverie. "I'll be out in just a moment," Kenichi said, grimacing as he jumped out of bed and went to where his school uniform was waiting for him. "As you say, sir, the rest of the family awaits you in the dining room." As he hurried to get dressed, Kenichi heard the head butler's gentle footsteps leaving. He cherished that aspect of his family. They made a consistent effort to share at least breakfast each morning. In his previous life, Kenichi was unaware of the amount of effort required to maintain wealth. Rich people had to put in even more effort just to keep what they had, if anything. Despite working extremely hard, his parents always found time for their kids. They made excellent parents. Before he saw his sister, he courteously greeted his parents when he entered the dining room. A part of him had known her all his life and adored her. She was his closest confidant and best friend. Because of their social status, they stayed close even as teenagers and had no secrets from one another. They were superior to most even though they attended a school for people with higher social status. Only a few political families could claim to be at the top of the social hierarchy. Because of this, they both had a very difficult time making real friends. There were more quid pro quo and fewer friends in their strata. Both of them were aiming for UA where they could both establish normal friendships and become normal students. Kenichi said, "Mother, Father, I believe that I've discovered more about my quirk and that we may have been mistaken in the full scope of its abilities, as everyone was consuming the last of their breakfast." That caught Momo's attention in addition to his parents. Up until now, everyone in the family including Hima had assumed that his quirk was just the capacity for shapeshifting. Although basic surface-level modifications were a very minor component of biological manipulation, shapeshifting was undoubtedly a crucial component. Momo appeared ecstatic that her older brother, who is 2 hours older than she is, might be more powerful than the family believed. There had always been a silent comparison between their individual quirks, even though he hadn't been mistreated or even looked down upon. She was able to create anything other than living things thanks to her quirk. Although she couldn't make a living mouse, she could make a dead one. It would be disgusting if she ever made a dead mouse. As Kenichi had once noted, her quirk made her incredibly versatile and powerful. If she so desired, she could eat as much fatty food as she pleased and turn it all into nuclear warheads. She wouldn't, of course. The point remained, however. They thought he could only alter his appearance to suit his preferences because she was essentially a walking nuclear deterrent. That disparity in skill was rather devastating. Is that so? Their father asked, glancing at Kenichi and slowly nodding. As kids grew older, they constantly found new facets of their quirks, and there were no indications of doubt or disbelief. Until proof was presented, judgment would be postponed. In light of this, Kenichi stood up and pointed to one of the room's 3 exits, saying, "If you would all follow me to the gym. Once there I can demonstrate." He was followed into the home gym by the entire family. Momo and he were the ones who used it the most, but everyone in the family did. Training their bodies was essential because they both wanted to become heroes. Momo had practiced her quirk by making nearly all of the gym equipment. Despite this, they had purchased identical products. His parents were strong proponents of economic support. They never once exploited Momo's quirk for their own financial or personal benefit. They would purchase anything she made using her quirk and donate it to a worthy cause if it was on the open market. To outfit their gym class, the gym traveled to a school that was struggling financially. Kenichi hurriedly took off the top half of his school uniform as soon as they entered the gym. With what he was going to do, he didn't want to get sweaty. His father gave him a somewhat disappointed look as soon as he took off his clothes, revealing a torso made entirely of sculpted muscle. Although Kenichi maintained his fitness, achieving and maintaining the body he now possessed would require full-time commitment to a gym. Adonis would have been envious of his flawlessly sculpted body. "Son, I thought we'd talked about the vain body modifications." As soon as the memory came to him, Kenichi flushed. He had gone through a phase where he had significantly altered his appearance with his quirk when puberty first struck and girls had gone from being gross cooties to interesting. He had made himself appear as attractive as possible, giving the impression that his body was well built. That's what any shapeshifter would have done. But his prior transformations had only been surface level. His muscles wouldn't get any stronger, even if he appeared toned. That was no longer the case. During breakfast, he had devoted all of his time to body sculpting. He could tune his own muscles to be as strong as humanly possible, make his bones denser to support his new strength, and reinforce everything else he could think of to make himself as physically strong as possible, but he couldn't make significant changes without some genetic samples to work with. With a serious expression on his face, he turned to face his father and said, "It's not like that, father. Just give me a moment and I will show that the changes I undergo are no longer just skin deep." His mother and sister appeared curious, and his father nodded. Kenichi swiftly increased the bench press's weight to 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds. Although it wasn't his maximum, 50 was the weight he used the most to stay in shape. When working out, he favored using less weight and doing more repetitions. He began pumping the weight up and down with apparent ease after setting everything up, saying, 50 kilos isn't too heavy for me, but it was previously still a fair bit of weight to be hefting up and down. After only a few repetitions, he picked up additional weight and increased it until he doubled the total to 100 kilograms. He began bench pressing the weight effortlessly once more. He started the exercise again, doubling the weight. Even 200 kilograms, or almost 450 pounds, was obviously not the limit of his strength, even though there were indications that more work was required. Everyone was appropriately impressed and intrigued as they watched him lift the rather large weights. After finishing his demonstration, he racked the weights and turned to face his father. I've never been able to change how strong I am, until now. Yesterday it would have been impossible for me to even lift the weight I just bench pressed. Now it's kind of easy. He wiped his torso with a towel as he went on. I think my quirk actually allows me to modify my body in more than simply looks. I'm not sure how far it goes and we'll need to spend time experimenting on it, but I think I can do a lot more than we ever imagined was possible with it. I hesitate to say this, but I think it might be just as versatile as Momo's, just in a different way. There was barely time for Kenichi to prepare for a flying Momo. Excited, she ran across the room and leapt into his arms to give him a hug. Only Momo's family was able to witness this aspect of her. They had to behave appropriately around the snobs they attended school with because they were the Yaoyorozu twins, heirs to the empire. But right now, at the age of 14, Momo was ecstatic about her brother's quirk being more powerful than they had thought. As their father cleared his throat, he interrupted them, saying, I see we will need to review your quirk, son. We'll do so this weekend and see if we can't figure out more details. On the inside, Kenichi was reeling, but he smiled at his father. Something had happened when he had given Momo a hug and she had touched his neck with her bare hand. For the first time in his life, he had fully and instantly comprehended her genetic composition. That was incredible in and of itself, but it went even farther. He now fully understood the genetic code that underpinned her quirk and realized that he could easily pass it on to himself if he so chose. At that discovery, his excitement was almost overwhelming. Yes, he was correct earlier. Ignore One for All's petty power. Without the disadvantage of totally stealing the quirk, he had an even more amazing version of All for One. Hell, if he had the right idea, he could even break down Momo's quirk and just keep the parts he wanted. Yes, he was eager to improve himself in every manner possible over the course of the following 10 months. Kenichi gazed at the UA entrance while sitting in the back of a limousine with its windows blacked out, where incoming students were continuously pouring in. A little more than 10 months had passed since he had fully awakened and started using his quirk to transform himself. The Open UA was held today. He came to participate in the exam and earn his place in the school. I still don't understand why you didn't take the recommendation exam with me, Oni-chan. He turned to face his beautiful sister, who was seated in the back of the limousine. With her arms folded beneath her still growing bust and a cute pout on her face, she appeared rather mulish at the moment. Her inability to decide whether to look away from him and pout or try to give him an angry glare made her little tantrum even cuter. Switching between the two rendered them utterly useless. Kenichi gave his distressed sister a kind smile. He was aware that her only concern was that he wouldn't receive a high enough score to be admitted to the school. Even though there was no chance of that occurring, irrational fear was unaffected. He reached out and gently grasped her shoulder. Momo, you know why I couldn't take the recommendation. Until last year everyone thought my quirk was only good in certain situations, like infiltration or impersonation. Everyone wants to see big flashy quirks, not some guy that can make himself look like a woman. Momo chuckled at him. I know. But that was a year ago. Now you're so much stronger. I've watched you work yourself to the bone to get where you are. You earned that recommendation. Kenichi gave a headshake. Like Momo, he had received a recommendation from his middle school. He did, however, believe that hers was well earned and that she had worked hard for it. He hadn't. Not from the perspective of the school, anyway. The family had chosen to remain silent about his potential after the alterations to his quirk had been investigated for a while. This implied that the school thought he was just a shapeshifter. They made the recommendation based only on his name and not on his true value. He simply wasn't the kind of person who would have followed the simple advice. He intended to win and prove himself to those who had questioned him. Momo, it'll be fine. I'm going to go in there and blow them all away. Thanks to the combined effort of everyone in the family, I'm now strong enough to stand with the best trying to get into UA. He grinned broadly. Just root for me, okay? Despite her worried pout, Momo nodded and said, of course. Do your best. Before he got out of the limousine, they gave each other a final embrace. There weren't many attractive young men getting out of pricey limos in front of the school, so his appearance attracted some attention. Ignoring them all, Kenichi picked up the bag the driver had left for him and straightened his clothes. For practical reasons, it held his change of clothes. Kenichi entered the school, carrying his bag on his shoulder, and proceeded to his testing location as instructed. He wasn't at all concerned about the written exam, which was the first part. He wasn't as smart as his younger sister, but he was still quite capable. Despite the fact that Momo studied ahead of time for subjects he didn't need to understand or had any interest in, the two of them were nearly always tied for first place on their exams. He had no interest in mechanical engineering or physics, for example. However, he had been immersing himself in everything related to animals, genetics, and quirk theory as if his life depended on it. He had visited every zoo in the nation during his quest, and after the exams were over, the whole family was traveling abroad to see more and meet some of the world's greatest heroes. He was going to imitate some strong quirks while his parents networked. A victory for the entire household. He had gathered dozens of them already, but the number of them he could have at any given time was limited. His body would begin to fail if he used more than a few fully functional quirks. He found a workaround, but it took some time. He concentrated on the secondary aspects of a quirk rather than taking an exact replica of it in order to improve himself infinitely. He could have easily used Momo's quirk exactly as she did, for instance. He would never, however, steal his sister's thunder in that manner. Rather, he utilized fragments of her quirk to augment his abilities. Because they both stored energy in their fat cells, he was able to improve his own storage capacity by about 25% by learning how her body did it. He also retained some of her power to transform fat cells into any element. This allowed him to create steel inside his body, which he could then use to line the edges of any flesh weapons he made. Among other things, in essence, it provided him with access to every element he might require for any future endeavors. He had once met the pro-hero Death Arms, for instance. The man had a mediocre quirk that only gave him extremely powerful arms. Kenichi was able to apply the part of his quirk code that greatly enhanced his muscles to every part of his body. Now his muscles were much stronger than before. However, it went beyond that. His entire body had to be somewhat improved in order for Death Arm's quirk to not destroy it when he used it. If lifting something heavy into the air crushed your legs, what good were super strong arms? The quirk included improved ligaments, bones, and other components. Simply put, they were only slight improvements in comparison to his arm's strength. By applying all of that to his body, Kenichi was able to give his entire body the durability and strength of Death Arm's arms. He had met and shook hands with a dozen professional heroes, and that was just one of them. Nearly all of the people he had encountered allowed him to enhance himself in some way. By simulating his wood growing process and applying it to cell growth, Kamui woods enabled him to significantly improve his regeneration. He was able to compress and expand portions of his body thanks to Mount Lady. He had a great deal of power because of them, the other students, and all the animals. It had taken him longer to become accustomed to his strength than to develop it. When he first started getting it all, he had seriously damaged the house, and his power was no joke. It got so bad that he didn't make any significant changes for the past month in order to give himself time to adjust to his current situation. When someone with superhuman strength unintentionally tears a door off its hinges, it may be amusing, but after that, it's just inconvenient. After he crushed his bedroom doorknob 10 times, it became so bad that he stopped changing it. It all came down to Kenichi being aware that he was ready for the test. He was excited to see everyone's reactions when he received his results because it would demonstrate his true abilities. Kenichi and the other students who had just completed the written exam trudged into the auditorium. It had been just as vicious as he had anticipated. Fortunately, his cute sister helped him prepare and study, so the test was more lengthy and annoying than challenging. The essay was the only part about which he was even slightly concerned. Thank heavens it hadn't been a cliché like, "What makes you want to be a hero?" President Mike quickly took the stage to explain the practical exam after he had located his designated seat in the auditorium. Kenichi began scanning his surroundings for members of the show's main cast. Thanks to multiple vision modes, he was able to adjust for the auditorium's relative darkness. However, he only employed low-light vision in this instance to maintain his color vision. It can be quite perplexing to see animals such as snakes. After a while, he noticed 3 different heads of hair. One bushy green, one pale blonde, and one blue. Midoriya Izuku, Bakugo Katsuki, and Ida Tenya. Naturally, they were much easier to identify because Ida had gotten up to chastise Midoriya for his mumbling as well as present Mike for an alleged error. Since Kenichi's hearing was adjusted to human normal, he hadn't actually heard anything from Midoriya's direction, but whatever. Perhaps Ida was simply too sensitive. In any event, Ida was obviously very tightly wound. Unfortunately, he would be in class with all 3 of those clowns if everything went according to his plan. Kenichi had to force himself not to sneer at Bakugo or Midoriya. For quite different reasons, he hated both of them. It was simple to despise Bakugo. To be honest, the little psychopath ought to have spent years behind bars. Bakugo should never have been given the opportunity, regardless of how much he changed and improved over the course of the show. He became an attempted murderer, or at least manslaughter, the instant he ordered Midoriya to end his own life. For Kenichi, that was enough to make him a villain. Then there were probably hundreds of instances in which Bakugo violated the laws against property damage, bullying, assault, and the use of quirks. Really, Bakugo would have probably been in a detention facility before he was a teenager if his parents and school weren't so bad at their jobs. There was another reason why he didn't like Midoriya. He genuinely would have liked to be friends with Midoriya as a child because he was a good man. But in Kenichi's eyes, he was a complete failure, and no, it wasn't because he had never been quirkless. It was Midoriya's utter incompetence. He frequently expressed his desire to be a hero, but he never once followed through on his words. His little notebooks were as close as he could get. As a hero, Kenichi would gladly declare those notebooks to be fantastic and full of possibilities. But Midoriya took no further action. Really, in order to improve his stamina, the man didn't even start jogging. He could have done a lot of things to help himself along the way to becoming a hero. To be honest, Kenichi believed that Midoriya would have had a lot of leeway to work with if quirks had been overused. Consider an individual such as Eraserhead. Yes, the man had a quirk, but it only prevented transformation and emitter quirks from functioning. For mutant types, it had no effect. However, the man could still use his body and skills to kick the living daylights out of the majority of his opponents. If you took away his quirk, he could still defeat villains with his training and hard work. He would be a goddamn hero even though he would never be number 1 or anything. However, did Midoriya actually work hard in the 10 years following his quirkless declaration? No, he didn't. However, all it took for him to become the chosen one, to inherit the absurd power of one for all was one selfless deed. It simply brought back too many memories of the issue he had with the majority of millennials in his previous life. Growing up expecting things to be handed to them and being given trash-like participation trophies. Yes, it was a brave, foolish, even heroic move to rush out to aid Bakugo, but All Might's attitude was hardly justified. Kenichi felt the impact of all that spitting on the years of hard work that everyone else had put in to reach their current position. His beloved sister had dedicated days to mastering the creation of a single, intricate chemical formula using her quirk. In order to have the energy to practice, she had made herself eat a lot of food. How that felt was only known to him. Having to sit down and eat enough food for 10 people just to practice for a few hours was repulsive and disheartening. Hell, even before his reincarnation fully awakened his quirk, he had put in a lot of effort to maximize any potential advantage his initial shapeshifting had given him. He had literally suffered as he disassembled his body at the cellular level and reorganized his limbs into combat-ready shapes. Shapeshifting fucking hurt almost instantly. After a quick stop at a locker room and changing area, Kenichi shook his head and started to leave the auditorium with the other students, heading for the fleet of buses that would take them to their exam grounds. He noticed a particularly unusual hairstyle as he boarded his assigned bus. It was purple, long, and spiky. It was also affixed to a man who appeared to be depressed. Kenichi grinned evilly when he saw him. This was his first opportunity to tamper with the canonical narrative. He might be able to get Shinso Hitoshi into the hero course if this worked. In general studies, the man's quirk, brainwash, was a complete waste and incredibly helpful. As he imagined Shinso brainwashing a Nomu into becoming his minion, Kenichi had to stifle a shiver of excitement. Just picture Shigaraki Tamura's face going into shock before his own Nomu delivers the punch. You look a little worried there. Quirk not quite as combat-oriented as others, he said, rushing to sit next to the melancholy-looking Shinso and shaking his hand. For anyone, Shinso's grimace at the accurate guess would have been sufficient evidence. After a brief moment of eyeing the hand in front of him, good manners forced him to accept it, saying something like that. Kenichi's eyes widened in surprise at the sudden knowledge of Shinso's quirk, so he didn't even need to pretend. Dude, the hell are you worried about? Your quirk is epic, he said quickly in a low voice that only the two of them and anyone with enhanced hearing could hear. Shinso asked, what could you possibly know about my quirk? As his eyes widened in surprise and then narrowed in suspicion. Kenichi responded by saying, sorry, it's an aspect of my quirk. It gives me information on the quirk of anyone I touch. Useful but not the main purpose of it. I don't know how you experience your quirk, but I see the core of it in your DNA. It's all overly complicated and scientific, but the skinny is, I know what your quirk is and how it works. And yet you're still talking to me? Shinso asked, casting a suspicious glance at the stranger conversing with him. Dude, you want to be a hero. Nuff said, Kenichi sneered. Look, I can guess what some narrow-minded jerks might have said about your quirk. Screw them. If you used your quirk to its full potential by, say, using it on yourself to change your attitude and free yourself from the shackles your body places on itself, you could easily give yourself an edge, he said in a conspiratorial tone. When it was suggested that Shinso use his brainwashing on himself, his eyes widened in shock. The possibility had never even occurred to him before. It would give him a clear edge, even if he only used it as a motivating tool to get through anything dull or to boost his energy. Although he detested math, he was able to brainwash himself into passing it. Kenichi smiled as he observed the gears turning in brain. Just remember, man, we're here to be heroes. Use your quirk to amp yourself up. If you want to help some folks out, ask to use your quirk on them to amp them up so they put in more effort. Sneak around the bots and look for weak points to exploit. I'm sure they took into account that not everyone has a heavily combat-oriented quirk. He was considering people such as Hagakure Toru. Physically, her invisibility didn't help her. Even so, it was a huge advantage to have invisible fists. He intended to mimic her quirk and try to integrate it with his chameleon genes. There are a ton of combinations and experiments to consider. He currently had Shinso's quirk to analyze, and once he had more time to practice it, he was determined to use it for self-hypnosis techniques. There was silence for the remainder of the bus ride as Shinso's mind raced, trying to come up with inventive and captivating uses for his quirk. Kenichi glanced at the other passengers as they got to their assigned gate and got off the bus. He wanted to see if he could locate anyone else he was truly interested in meeting. He was able to identify a couple of people in passing but was unable to pinpoint their identities. The white-haired black man had probably been in Class 1B. When he thought about black people, he wasn't being racist either. The man was a living shadow, completely black. Shadows had something to do with his quirk, didn't they? Something to remember. The beast of UA, Shishida Jirota, was the last person he knew by name. Elevated. The big blue mutant from his previous life was clearly referenced in this character. For that alone, how could he not at least like the character a little? Kenichi put aside his tourist gaze and concentrated on himself and his exam preparations. With a lot of villain and hero points, he wouldn't accept anything less than first place. He also had every intention of destroying the zero-pointer. He grinned as he made sure his clothes were in order. His attire wasn't particularly noteworthy, to be honest. Although it appeared to be a straightforward track suit, the jacket top's arms were substantially weaker and thinner than the rest of the ensemble. It was designed to be easily torn apart, allowing him to shapeshift his arms into any desired shape. Already, he was calming himself in anticipation of the upcoming shifting. Finally, the entire ensemble was a tad too big on him right now. Begin. Kenichi let go of his grip as Present Mike yelled that the test had started. It took him a very long time to figure out how to control his tremendous strength and speed. But now, he let go of those restraints with a noticeable and audible thump, as his body and muscles slightly grew. Although he had previously appeared fit, his muscles now gave him the appearance of a professional lifter. A loud thunderclap that sent a shockwave through the air followed a moment later. Two tiny craters had formed where Kenichi's feet had been where he had been standing. What are you all waiting for? There's no countdown in real life. Go go go. As he shot through the air faster than sound, Kenichi grinned menacingly. As soon as he saw his first villain robot, he charged straight at it. Yes, this was going to be a lot of fun. As he shot through the air into the cityscape that served as his testing ground, Kenichi couldn't contain his laughter. He found it annoying to constantly hold back, so letting go of all his constraints felt liberating. Of course, he could make himself weaker and only strengthen himself when needed, but he thought that was a bad idea. He would become susceptible to unexpected assaults or events occurring in front of him if he developed the habit of keeping himself weak. Even though he didn't have to worry about it every day, he would eventually have to deal with it. Instead of battling it later when he was even more powerful, it made more sense to learn to hold himself back now. As he tapped into and then amplified his bioenergy, golden lightning began to spark around his body. Whatever you chose to call it, ki, kai, chakra, etc. All of these were simply different names for the same thing, life force. He had enormous amounts of it at his disposal because of his quirk, and eating only made him have more to work with. Other than temporarily improving himself, he hadn't been able to accomplish much with it. He hoped to eventually be able to use it to fire energy blasts, but for the time being, that seemed like a long way off. Rather, he simply employed it as an all-around enhancement of his physical prowess. He swiftly blew past the city's outermost layer of robots and headed for the ones farther inside. Before more students could fight their way past the first layer, he intended to remove as many as he could. He blew past a few blocks before slowing down to find his targets. One of the 2 pointers ended up being his first target. He just charged all the way through the scorpion-like robot's torso without even trying to slow down or do anything else. At the moment, he could easily crash through entire buildings without stopping because his body was strong and resilient. Although he hadn't tested it, he was fairly certain that he was bulletproof right now. This implied that the robots had nothing to threaten him with or to frighten him in the slightest, with the exception of the 0-pointer. He was fairly certain that the thing could pound him deeply into the ground, even though it might not be able to kill him. He grinned when he saw one of the tank-like 3-pointers after blowing through the 2-pointer. He had complete freedom to experiment with all the tricks he had been considering, and this was a great chance. With haste, he raised his right arm and pointed his palm at the robot. Kenichi's arm quickly shifted shape as it turned to face him. A hole appeared on his palm, and his muscles swelled outward, tearing the sleeve apart. His forearm grew like a balloon, and there was a low whine. To be honest, it was a little unsettling to look at. "Air cannon," exclaimed Kenichi, unconcerned. Hey, brand recognition was something that needed to be worked on right away, and the rule of cool applied to being a superhero. His forearm muscles instantly and violently contracted as he called out the name of his attack, using every fiber of superpowered muscle to compress the air that had been drawn inside into the smallest possible form. Then it was pushed through the comparatively tiny opening in his palm. The outcome was expected. His palm released a blast of compressed air, which struck the robot with enough force to break it apart and scatter its remnants for a block. Kenichi did not take long to sit back and celebrate his achievement. He shifted his arms and took off instantly. As was to be expected, their new shape made them bulge while tearing apart what was left of his tracksuit jacket's sleeves. He shifted into huge slicing blades, bulking up and extending his arms slightly. Better yet, the blades' edges were a unique blend of carbon steel that had been expertly sharpened to the point where razors would be jealous. He owed Momo a debt of gratitude for possessing such a lovely quirk from which he could take inspiration. Without her quirk, the edges of his blades would probably be made of hardened bone. He swung out his left arm and blew past a 1-pointer. Like a hot knife through butter, the blade cut through the robot's unicycle support struts. The tin can toppled over and shattered on the sidewalk without his having to look. He concentrated on his sense of smell as it descended. This combination, which was specific to heavy machinery, gave the robots a very distinct smell. Grease, hydraulic fluid, electrical ozone, oil, hot rubber, and other related materials. He found the closest machines with his nose and removed them in one of 3 main ways. The air cannon blast, the blade, or blunt force trauma. Every now and then, he added some spice. He chose to have a little fun for one of the 1-pointers. His arms were 10 times larger than usual, giving him a rather absurd appearance. He did have a little more strength because of his larger stature, but his reach and leverage were more important. He lifted the 1-pointer into the air by grabbing its torso, which was under its arms. He flipped himself backwards, launching the robot into the air and giving it a perfect suplex while grinning maniacally. He saw several other potentials staring at him in disbelief as he straightened up. His arms returned to normal size, and he smiled cockily at them all. "What the hell? Did you just suplex that robot?" yelled one of the other people who was staring angrily. Kenichi gave a thumbs up, laughed, and then broke through the sound barrier with another thunderclap. He continued to move and destroy robots, but he did pause to assist anyone who appeared to be overpowered and alone or about to be ambushed by the bots. He did observe Shinso once lending a helping hand to someone who had a weak quirk while they shared one on 2 pointers. In fact, those with weak and or non-combat related quirks could use the bots, off switches in specific, vital, locations if they possessed some degree of physical prowess. Examining the setup, a quirkless person who committed to physical training could easily pass the test. Aizawa could have passed this exam in his day, after all, and his quirk was as useless as a spitwad against the robots. Perhaps he did. When they began using robots for the testing, Kenichi was unsure. When the ground started to tremble and a truly enormous machine of epic proportions appeared, he quickly dismissed his thoughts and the careless dismemberment of a 3-pointer. At the moment, it was tearing itself out of a big building where it had been concealed. Since there was nowhere else to conceal such a huge machine, it made sense to conceal the enormous-ass robot inside a fictitious office building. Kenichi laughed as the robot trundled out of its hiding place, scattering the test-takers like rats. As he gazed at the enormous machine, his heart pounded with anticipation. With a quick mental calculation, he smiled widely. At the moment, he was fairly certain that he had 84 villain points and an unspecified number of hero points. Bakugo had scored 70-something points, which was good enough for first place. He had blown that out of the water so he could enjoy fighting the enormous robot for a while instead of chasing points. None of the other machines had yet to present a challenge or an incentive for him to use his skills beyond a certain point. But the big guy, his face split into a slightly manic grin. He started strengthening himself with hardened steel, and his entire body seemed to move slightly. The metal covered and shielded all of his fingers and joints, enhancing both his defense and offensive capabilities at the same time. Furthermore, as he energized himself, the tiny glimmerings of golden lightning that surrounded his body abruptly intensified and turned into flaming bursts of energy. He assumed a runner's starting stance, crouching and pressing his fists to the concrete. He heard a huge explosion from one of the other testing grounds just before he launched himself. Without a doubt, Midoriya destroyed his 0-pointer. There was not much time left. Kenichi launched with such force that the ground he left behind shattered into a crater with a thunderous boom. As he broke the barrier of sound, the air itself seemed to burst. He cocked his arm back in preparation for a quick shift as he screamed through the air toward the 0-pointer's head. He couldn't help but scream at the top of his lungs, "I cast fist." As an old memory came flooding back, he threw his arm forward and made it enormous as soon as he was done talking. He used all the force he could muster to slam his massive, steel-covered fist into the 0-pointer's head. The outcomes were amazing. His enormous fist, powered by his super strength, crushed the robot's head completely. The enormous machine's head was torn off by the force and sent flying, crushed like a tin can. The force and momentum of the blow caused the entire robot to tilt back and start to fall while small explosions shook it. Kenichi fell carelessly toward the ground, cackling like a crazy person. At his current height, he had nothing to fear from falling, and it was a lovely sight to watch the enormous, terrifying robot disintegrate from secondary explosions. Only a few seconds after he touched down did a siren sound, signaling the conclusion of the test. The remaining teachers sat in a room with monitors to watch the potential students as President Mike declared that the practical exam would begin. A voice that sounded lazy said, "Someone actually listened and didn't need further instructions." How rare. This came after Kenichi's explosive start. A few others laughed at the remark. Seldom did a prospective student take off as soon as they were given the all-clear. Most were perplexed because they were anticipating a countdown or something. When Kenichi smashed through the first robot without even attempting to resist, the teachers were paying attention because of his rapid start. Curious, the same slack-jawed voice opened Kenichi's student file and swiftly and effectively perused it before saying, "Well, that's clearly not right." Oh. At the same time, a squeaky male voice and a husky female voice inquired. His quirk is listed simply as shapeshifting. Yet he just plowed through a 2-pointer like it wasn't even there. The slacky voice then moved the information about Kenichi's quirk to the main screen so that everyone could see it. They might not be hardened reinforced steel, but they're not paper match either. He swiftly pulled up Yaotarozu Momo's student file, and everyone could see the familial resemblance. Their quirks don't seem to have much in common, at first look. The squeaky voice hummed as it read the details. Ah, he's the twin brother of one of our recommended students. Air cannon. Everyone watched in shock as Kenichi used a compressed burst of air to make his first three-pointer. I suppose, technically speaking, inflating one's arm like that qualifies as shapeshifting, the squeaky voice said once more. That certainly doesn't though. We'll have to pull him in to ask why his quirk registry is incorrect. For a family like the Yaoyorozus to neglect something like that, the squeaky voice sighed as Kenichi's arms transformed into enormous metal blades. Unspoken was the fact that the Yaoyorozu family would have to have a very serious secret that needed to be kept safe in order for them to remain silent. Particularly considering that their daughter already possessed such a horrifying gift. Perhaps ignorant people would find her skill intriguing. However, a rational person would see that the young lady had the capacity to wipe out humanity. Nuclear war and economic collapse were two very obvious strategies, but there were also more covert strategies. The Yaoyorozu family appeared to have created two real monsters. As Kenichi stopped acting strangely or absurdly, the teachers talked about other pupils. However, they joyfully observed that he was equally eager to assist others as he was to completely destroy robots. Just prior to releasing the zero-pointer, Kenichi's arms expanded to allow him to suplex a one-pointer, giving them yet another surprise. It was kind of pointless and completely excessive. Nevertheless, it was amusing and caused the onlookers to smirk or smile. They received not one, but two significant surprises after they released the zero-pointers. The first came from a player who appeared to be headed for 0 hero points after managing to accrue 0 villain points overall. The participants were unaware that the robot would never have harmed the girl they saw trapped on the ground. With such force that he clearly broke both of his legs, the young man abruptly leapt off the ground. His legs flapping in the wind was clearly visible to them. They saw him destroy his arm to deliver a devastating blow to the zero-pointer, which was even more horrifying than the ruthless destruction of his legs. They witnessed the enormous explosion from Kenichi's feet shortly after the first startling blow, as he also shot into the air in the direction of his Area zero-pointer. They might not have had a camera angle up to spot someone, but a cursory glance revealed no one in imminent danger. They recorded everything for later review because there was a lot of ground to cover. All of them were stunned as Kenichi's arm grew enormous and annihilated the zero-pointer with a single blow. Those monsters. It's been years since anyone's destroyed a zero-pointer and now they've taken out two. At the same time, do they know how much work I put into building and maintaining them? A man punched the wall as he saw not one, but two of the zero-pointers collapse. After a brief period of sympathetic silence, the squeaky voice said, Aizawa-kun, if you would be so kind as to find and escort Yaoyorozu Kenichi to my office, I would appreciate it. Aizawa, the slack-jawed voice, acknowledged his boss Principal Nezu's request with a frustrated grunt. Kenichi was unable to contain his smile as he observed the stunned and amazed expressions of those around him as they glanced between him and the still exploding zero-pointer. Kenichi remained silent, but as he made his way to the exit, he noticed Shinso and gave the purple Ed a thumbs up while mouthing, "Good luck." Everyone returned to the buses and took them back to the main campus after the excitement subsided. Not even Shinso dared to sit next to Kenichi. He didn't let it bother him, even though it was a bit of a bummer. He spent his time imagining Momo's adorable, amazed expressions when he told her everything about the test. He knew very well that he was turning into a cis-con. He didn't find his sister sexually attractive, so he could put up with that. Even before his recollections of a previous existence in which she was merely an anime character, he could honestly acknowledge that she was a knockout, but she was his sister, and that was that. Follow me, kid. We got questions. Kenichi's smile didn't even waver as he walked out of the locker room wearing his street clothes and saw Aizawa walking toward him with a dull, bored expression. Kenichi simply nodded before stepping in sync with Aizawa. He had anticipated that they would want to ask him about his quirk, but only after they had started the review process. On a live feed, they must have caught him performing one of his bizarre stunts. It was inconsequential. They would understand why his quirk registry was off once he explained the circumstances. Kenichi was not at all disappointed to see Nezu for the first time when they walked into an office. Am I a mouse? A dog? A bear? I'm the principal, Nezu said in his somewhat squeaky voice, and he couldn't help but smile. Kenichi bowed respectfully and kept his warm smile. If his parents found out, they would scold him for not doing so, which would be beneath his dignity. It's an honor to meet you, Principal Nezu. As I'm sure you're aware, I'm Yaoyorozu Kenichi, feel free to call me Kenichi. Kenichi gladly accorded Nezu the respect he deserved. I take it from your lack of surprise that you are aware of why I asked you to come here, Kenichi-kun. Nezu said after observing Kenichi for a moment. Kenichi gave a nod. Of course, though I honestly expected to be called in during the review process. I believe you're curious about my quirk and why what I showed doesn't fit with shapeshifting, correct? Correct. With a nod, Kenichi concluded that there was no excuse for lying. Primarily, he certainly wouldn't discuss reincarnation. It's simple really. Originally my quirk did appear to simply be the ability to shapeshift, within a given limit. However, about a year ago, I realized I could do more than simply change how I appeared. I could change myself on a fundamental level. When I was shapeshifting into adults, I was becoming an adult. When I shifted back to my regular self, I was becoming a kid once more. A little effort and I found I could change not just appearance, but my very body on any level. Stronger muscles, denser bones, faster healing, and so on. If I had to pick a new name for my quirk, it would be biokinesis. Nezu grumbled, you Yaoyorozus are a scary bunch. Still, your family didn't hide what Momo-chan could do, why hide what you can do? Easy. Momo can destroy the world in nuclear fire, but humanity would probably survive in some way. If people truly understood what I could do, it could destroy humanity. He seemed utterly serious as he gazed at the stunned expressions of Nezu and Aizawa. I am biologically immortal. If that, among other secrets, got out to the general public, well, I'm sure you can imagine the damage that could be done. As Nezu reviewed the information he had been given, there was silence. He was among the smartest people on the planet, if not the smartest, thanks to his quirk, high spec. The conclusions he was drawing bothered him. You've implied that there's worse secrets. Kenichi replied, not only can I manipulate my body in any fashion I desire, I can manipulate the bodies of other people. Oh, it's not to the extent I can manipulate myself, but I can mess with their genetics. I could turn men into women and vice versa. I could induce, or cure, cancer. I could quite possibly create a devastating deadly plague worse than anything the world has ever seen before. And, of course, induce biological immortality in people. My sister can destroy the world, I can make it rip itself to shreds. Nezu gave a deep sigh. That's all very terrifying, but it doesn't explain how you did what you did during the exam. Kenichi replied, that's the last horrifying secret. When I touch someone, I can read their entire genetic structure in an instant. It's a nifty little trick and lets me know all about their quirk. Once I know that, I can change my own genetic structure to match. In essence, I can copy, and even give, quirks with just a harmless touch. Dead. Quiet. Man, kids these days are scary. Nezu gave Aizawa's remark a snort. The two of them were still in shock over the revelations that had been thrown at them, and Kennick had just left his office. Nezu decided to have a little fun with Aizawa and said, and just think, the pair of them will be in your class. Nezu found Aizawa's moan to be melodious. He continued by saying, we'll have to keep a close eye on the pair of them. I don't believe they'll go bad, but I'd rather keep a watch out for anything that could cause a change in their desired paths. He omitted the amount of effort he would need to put in to conceal the truth about Kenichi's quirk. He wasn't entirely certain that All for One was dead, and he wouldn't be until he actually saw the old villain's body. At least Yagi had at last given the next generation the One for All mantle. The fact that Aizawa would actually have 3 monsters in his class this year was something he really wanted to emphasize. He had genuinely assumed that Todoroki Shoto and Midoriya Izuku would be this year's troublesome kids before he met Kenichi. He obviously had others to keep a closer eye on. As he strolled through the corridors of UA, Kenichi whistled a lively tune to himself, in the direction of the nurse's office. You don't look hurt, Sonny. There's a reason you're here. The elderly woman known as the youthful heroine, Recovery Girl, scowled as he entered the room, looking up from her paperwork. Indeed there is, Kenichi said, nodding and bowing courteously to Recovery Girl. I'm Yaoyorozu Kenichi and I expect I will be joining this prestigious school when next semester begins. To that end, I wanted to meet you and offer my services as a healer. He straightened up and grinned broadly. The elderly woman was immediately drawn to it and asked, you have a healing quirk? With a mediocre hand gesture, Kenichi said, it's not specifically geared toward healing, more of a side effect I suppose. With a stern expression, Recovery Girl said, explain properly, I'm not getting any younger. Kenichi laughed and nodded. Right, sorry. In essence, I can't heal people, not really. My quirk lets me manipulate my body to a ridiculous degree. For example, she could see both of his hands clearly as he raised them. In an instant, a razor-sharp blade appeared on the tip of his left index finger. He cut open the palm of his right hand, winced a little. Even though he could numb himself, cutting his hand open on purpose was unsettling. When Recovery Girl noticed the blood accumulating on his hand's palm, she leapt to her feet. Kenichi motioned for her to wait a moment while his hand nearly immediately repaired the harm he had caused. So you can regenerate yourself to an impressive degree, but I don't see. As the pool of blood contracted and transformed from the initial red liquid into an additional index finger that emerged directly from the center of Kenichi's palm, she trailed off. Before appearing to melt back into his hand, it even curled a few times to wave her a finger. When she looked away from his hand, Kenichi clarified, "With a touch I can read and understand someone's genetic structure perfectly. From there I can use my own body's resources to create replacement parts for the patient. Even if it's just skin or blood cells, and then install the replacement parts into their body." His grin widened when he noticed the surprise that the Recovery Girl's face. "I can heal injuries, make replacement organs, even regrow lost limbs, all with perfectly matching genetics to prevent rejection. And, as I said, it uses my body's resources, meaning I can even heal people near death." Before coming here to help Recovery Girl, Kenichi had told Nezu and Aizawa as much as he wanted to about his quirk. He had to explain his quirk to Nezu. The principal's intelligence was frightening, and he could have deduced most, if not all, of his quirk from observation alone. If Kenichi had remained silent and simply carried out his duties, they would have become suspicious of him. It wasn't worth the trouble and effort to try to hide something from Nezu and then deal with his suspicion because Kenichi had no intention of being a villain. Therefore, having Nezu watch him as though he would suddenly turn evil would have been counterproductive. He was now telling Recovery Girl about his capacity for healing, particularly organ replacement, for one very significant reason. All power. He could restore All Might to optimal health. Even though Midoriya had received one for all from All Might, this did not render him worthless. All Might being fully recovered would still be something to keep an eye on, even though he wouldn't be the same powerhouse as before. It was another hero who was prepared to battle the impending darkness. Furthermore, it would lessen the negative effects of his retirement and might even eliminate his current time limit. Prior to All Might deflating after taking All for One's block away, it hadn't been bad, but it was definitely not good. Could Kenichi keep all of his skills to himself? Yes, he could, but why would he want to? They could still go horribly wrong even if he makes an effort to make things better. For example, a butterfly flaps its wings. Therefore, ensuring that everyone was as strong and ready as possible was his best chance to not only survive the ordeal but also to safeguard those who were important to him. It would be extremely beneficial to heal All Might. Then there were the things he could do to help his peers. Imagine if he granted Midoriya the ability to regenerate. All of the stupid person's self-harm was quickly repaired. When Midoriya breaks his hand's bones, does it prevent them from healing properly? Watch as he grows new hands and cut off his goddamn hands. Does Kirishima struggle with endurance? Give him the capacity to consume enormous quantities of food, just like Momo and himself, so he can indulge and have extra supplies on hand for emergencies. Is Ashido incapable of managing her own most potent acid? Improve her ability to withstand acid. Does Tokiyami have a problem with Dark Shadow losing control in complete darkness? Give him fluorescence so he can create his own light and control Dark Shadow until he gains mastery. These were only a handful of his few small suggestions for enhancing his classmates and giving them greater influence in the upcoming conflicts. Only buffs for their quirks were considered. There was so much more he could do for them. He could boost their base strength, speed up their recovery, greatly intensify their senses, and more. All of it had one drawback: time. It would take longer for them to completely integrate if he made more or larger genetic changes. He had made some changes to Momo over the past 10 months and had information on how long it would take for one to integrate completely. A long time, was the response. His top goal had been to give Momo a healing factor by improving her healing capacity. He believed it wasn't safe to try to make any more changes during that 4-month period. He then gave her the same abalone-enhanced hide that he had for himself in order to increase her durability. 3 more months were needed for that. He had given her a treatment to build up her muscles and make her much stronger, and he was less concerned about her because she had good defensive skills. That therapy was still going on. In nearly a year, he had only been able to administer 3 treatments to her, one of which was still ongoing. It was evident how long it would take him to outperform his peers and how cautious he would need to be when making choices. Since it was their body, they would naturally have a say in how they were altered. All of this was a convoluted way of expressing his intention to do everything within his power to strengthen not only himself but also everyone in his immediate vicinity. After taking a deep breath and observing the young man in front of her, Recovery Girl said, "That's pretty impressive, kid. I'll talk to the principal about having you set up for emergency calls and after-school lessons on proper medicine. I can't make you into a proper doctor, but I can make you into the best possible field medic." With a smile, Kenichi nodded and said, "It would be my pleasure." After talking over a few specifics, Kenichi's phone triggered a notification alert. He quickly checked, said goodbye to Recovery Girl, and departed from the main campus. You could see his horse sitting in front of the main gates. On that particular day, very few, if any, other students had their own limousine to take them to and from school. The driver opened the rear door as he got closer and shut it after Kenichi was inside. Momo stood impatiently waiting for him. They gave each other a brief embrace in greeting, and Kenichi smiled. They were very close because neither of them had many, if any, friends as children. "Well?" Momo asked impatiently after their brief embrace ended. With a laugh and a nod, Kenichi said, "I'm sure I got in." Kenichi's already elevated mood was further enhanced by Momo's squeal of delight and the ensuing bone-crushing embrace of excitement. "Tell me everything," she demanded as soon as she released him. So he did. He shared every moment of his day with Momo, but he focused especially on the practical test. The suggested students would have taken the same written tests as those who took the regular exams. Thus, the only thing that was different was the practical. Nezu also required the suggested students to participate in a face-to-face interview. Something that Kenichi shared with them now. He mentioned his conversations with Recovery Girl and Nezu. He had no secrets from Momo, and he never would, aside from his recollections of a previous existence. Their conversation continued until they reached the manor house in the area that their parents had purchased for them. Anyone else would probably refer to it as a mansion, but he called it a manor. He would have undoubtedly regarded it as a mansion in his previous life. But in reality, it was a tiny manor house in comparison to the main Yaoyorozu residence. He turned to Momo as they walked into the parlor and said, "I'm going to get cleaned up." He wasn't entirely clean, even though he had cleaned himself up after the practical exam. It was filthy work destroying robots, and as he tore them apart, he got different splatters of grease and other fluids all over his body. After a moment of tilting her head, Momo said, "I'll join you." With a simple shrug, Kenichi headed for the master bathroom. Although every bedroom had its own private bathroom, the manor's central, family, bathroom was enormous. After receiving his memories of his previous life, he had been slightly troubled by this aspect of Japanese culture, the family bath. In contrast to most cultures, family bathing together, even during adolescence and adulthood, was not regarded as taboo. Rather, it was an effective means of preserving strong familial bonds. He had therefore grown accustomed to taking a family bath with everyone once in a while. 2 15-year-old teenagers taking a bath together might still have been viewed negatively by some. For them, it had no sexual overtones at all and was merely a bit of family skinship. It was nothing new, not forbidden fruit, or anything scandalous. They had seen each other naked all their lives. It was merely a bath. Before grabbing some towels and entering the main bathing area, the two of them undressed in the antechamber. There was a huge tub that always had hot, clean water in it, as well as multiple showers for washing. "It's been a few days since I last checked, but how is your strength progressing?" Kenichi inquired as they cleaned themselves in the showers. "I bench pressed 250 kilos yesterday, so pretty well." As he poured shampoo onto his hand, Kenichi whistled, "Not bad. It will skyrocket once the conversion process is complete. Still, that's like pre-quirk era record weightlifting there." After making a light lather with his hands, he sat behind Momo and started to work the shampoo into her hair. Taking care of it on her own was a pain in the ass because she wore it for a long time. When they did things like, "How about your rapid response items?" he didn't mind lending a hand. "I've got another one practiced to perfection." Momo was given a list of rapid response items to memorize and practice making until she could do it with a single thought. Something like the bow staff, which she enjoyed making and using for combat, would have been regarded as a rapid response item in the original timeline. He had bribed her into writing down every item on the list he had assisted her in creating. He had assisted Momo in deepening her comprehension of her quirk ever since he had regained his memories. She lacked imagination, but that's not to say she was bad at it. She could actually create theoretical elements with her quirk. He wasn't really aware of that's potential or what those components could be used for. Nevertheless, she could receive credit for creating them if she created blocks of them. To the best of his memory, they could only be produced using the Large Hadron Collider, and even then, their duration was limited to microseconds, or something similar. He had never given those things much thought. But, flash-bang-like things, they were as valuable as the back of her hand. There were many circumstances in which using a flash-bang could be helpful. There was also a gas mask. Although it's not something you need very often, you should have it on hand for when you do. In actuality, that was only the beginning. In order for Momo to produce legally protected goods for her own use, they even had their parents pay a respectable sum of money for a license. As long as the products kept their branding and weren't sold to the general public, she was legally permitted by several hero support item companies to manufacture their goods using her quirk. I'm glad to hear it. How about your costume design? Did my suggestions help? He said, pleased to learn that she had become so proficient at using another item that she could pull it out at the drop of a hat. He had always been bothered by that aspect of Momo's original outfit. Yes, he really enjoyed it when she wasn't his sister. It was great fan service material and rather attractive on her. But as her brother, he found the design to be extremely annoying. He therefore made a number of recommendations after she created the original idea that maintained a good amount of skin exposure without coming close to being as indecent as the leotard one had been. As he ran his fingers over her scalp, Momo blushed slightly but nodded, saying, yes, the redesign is finished. The computer too, Momo sighed, though he wasn't sure if it was from the question or the scalp massage. Momo had initially intended to have a book with brief explanations and notes on topics she hadn't yet fully committed to memory. But Kenichi had shown how foolish it was to have a physical book. Now she would have a holographic display and a reinforced wrist computer with voice recognition. She squirmed slightly in embarrassment and looked down, saying, yes, the computer too. Thank you for helping me with my costume. I did it out of personal greed. The last thing I want is my sister being exposed to perverts. Kenichi said, dismissing the remark. Speaking of perverts, he would see to it that that little bastard was quickly expelled if Mineta Minoru and his sister were still in Class 1A. Completing it would also be rather simple. A university such as UA would not want to be involved in a student's sexual harassment prosecution. That's precisely what would happen to the short shit if he even glanced at Momo incorrectly. He detested the show's Mineta. He detested him so much that he wished the character would be the first to meet a terrible end. The little shit was always disappointing. The little bastard was so repulsive that even his costume a diaper. Really. Nor did he simply despise perverted characters. He didn't want Kaminari Denki to die in excruciating pain, after all. Although Kamienri was also a pervert, at least he was much more subdued and aware of the boundaries. Simply put, Mineta didn't contribute anything. Every scene in which Mineta appeared was excruciating. He seized the chance to increase Shinso Hitoshi's chances of passing the practical as soon as he saw him, in part because he detested the little purple bastard. The twins resumed their normal activities after taking a bath. It would be at least a week, if not two, before they received Kenichi's results because school was out for the summer. Thus, the family met as scheduled and departed Japan for their networking trip. Kenichi simply wanted to shake hands with the foreign heroes that her parents wanted to network with. Not to mention all of the scheduled zoo visits that included one-on-one meet and greets with the most exotic creatures. Indeed, Kenichi was eagerly anticipating his time overseas. Momo and Kenichi shared a seat in the rear of their limousine. They hadn't wanted to bring it to school. In order to blend in a little better and avoid overtly displaying their wealth, they would have preferred to use public transportation. Kenichi didn't want to, anyway. Momo had happily slapped people in the face with their wealth on multiple occasions and could be pretty clueless. She did it with a purity and innocence that few could match, so no one was particularly offended. However, their parents had insisted on the limo ride because of a small villain attack that had occurred the night before not far from their manor. Even though he and Momo were practically demigods, their parents were still concerned about them. Really, it was quite touching. Once more, Momo checked his tie and brushed some imaginary lint off his shoulders after they got out of the back of the limousine. She would concentrate on him whenever she felt anxious. She said softly, "I'm so happy we'll be in the same class like always. I'm not sure what I would do without you around." He indulged her anxious habit. Kenichi simply nodded and grinned. Since they started school, they had been in the same class. The majority of schools opposed separating twins from one another. However, he anticipated that if they hadn't needed Aizawa to teach the two of them, they wouldn't have given a damn and would have parted ways. He suspected that because Aizawa was the homeroom teacher, they had both been assigned to Class 1A. His quirk had the power to neutralize their quirks and halt them in their tracks. That was why the more erratic quirks were in his class. Although not all of his pupils possessed volatile quirks, how else could Bakugo, Midoriya, Todoroki, and Tokiyami have been placed in the same class? It would take someone like Aizawa to prevent the six of them from truly losing control of their quirks. It just made sense. He was a little let down that this was only his second visit to the school as they entered the main entrance of the first-year campus. He had anticipated that Nezu or Recovery Girl would get in touch with him to examine All Might before healing the big lug. However, there had been absolutely no word. His acceptance letter had been the only communication. He had entered first, as he had anticipated. Even so, he had 44 rescue points, 92 villain points, and a few more than he had counted. His record-breaking total of 136 points was achieved as a result. Bakugo only scored 77 villain points, so that was a significant lead of 59 points. Hopefully, they would ask him to heal the enormous blonde ham now that the school year had begun. He was absolutely certain that they would as soon as the USJ incident occurred, even if they didn't. Nobody could possibly lay down while the students were in danger. At that point, he would probably beg for healing. Kenichi wouldn't force him to beg. He could have All Might fit as a fiddle in an hour, 2 tops, with just a whispered request. As they reached the big door to Classroom 1A, Kenichi was pulled from his reverie. Since the large door was clearly made for people with large bodies, he felt no need to comment. It made sense because Shoji Mezzo was so large and ought to be a student. It was well balanced, as evidenced by how easily it slid open to reveal an empty classroom. At Momo's insistence, they had come an hour early. Her goal was to create a positive first impression. All Kenichi wanted to do was shake hands with his new classmates. He had no intention of completely replicating the majority of their quirks. In fact, it would be extremely risky for him to give himself a working duplicate of each student's quirk. Even though he currently had complete control over every atom of his existence, quirk singularity was a real worry, and if he assumed too much power at once, he might not. He continued to focus on the ancillary advantages of people's quirks for this reason as well. Although he could replicate Endeavor's flames, he would much rather simply replicate his heat resistance and call it a day. It gave him a great power boost while maintaining his own quirk factor. When the twins discovered they were sitting next to each other at their desks, they grinned. In a light-hearted manner, Kenichi bowed courteously to his sister and said, "I look forward to spending the year with you, madam." With a giggle, Momo imitated his movements and said, "And I you, sir." That made them both laugh, and they settled in. In pleasant silence, they waited until students started to arrive. Everything they needed to talk about was already covered. Momo was aware that he should not reveal the full extent of his quirk until he felt comfortable doing so. For the next 30 minutes, they mostly remained silent, only occasionally making remarks or speculating about their possible classmates. Because they arrived so much earlier than any of the other students, Kenichi made sure to make fun of Momo a little. Nevertheless, Ida Tenya entered the classroom precisely 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, and she did so without any surprise. Ida was shocked to see them, but Kenichi wasn't shocked to see him. When he saw them, his stiff movements stopped, and he uttered a soft, "Oh. I honestly expected to be the first student to arrive today. How wonderful to meet 2 other such conscientious students. I am Ida Tenya and I look forward to spending the next 3 years with you," Ida said, clearing his throat before continuing into the classroom with his somewhat iconic stiff robotic movements. With that, he bowed a courteous greeting. Both Momo and Kenichi stood up and exchanged bows. Speaking on their behalf, Kenichi said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ida-san. I am Yaoyorozu Kenichi and this is my twin sister Yaoyorozu Momo. We look forward to spending the next 3 years with you." Kenichi was less bashful than Momo. "Ah, Yaoyorozu Kenichi-san. The one who took first place in the practical exam," Ida said, straightening up and waving his arm in a stiff but enthusiastic manner. Kenichi grinned and nodded. One and the same, and please, call me Kenichi. It makes it less confusing between myself and my sister without having to use our full names to address us. Then please feel free to call me Tenya, Ida said, extending his hand for Kenichi to shake. Ida offered Momo his hand after they shook hands, and she accepted it, saying, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ida-san." He reiterated his offer to Momo so she could call him by his given name, and the three of them started talking quietly as they waited for more people to show up. When Ida learned that Momo had been recommended in addition to Kenichi having placed first in the open exams, he was impressed. He was appropriately impressed to learn that Kenichi had rejected a recommendation. As more and more students started to arrive, the pace of greetings and conversations picked up. In the end, Momo was dragged off to talk to a few girls, including Jiro Kyoka, Ashido Mina, and Hagakure Toru. As his sister quickly became friends with the three girls, Kenichi was ecstatic for her. He discovered that he was conversing with Honta Siro, Kirishima Eijiro, Kaminari Denki, and Ida Tenya. After making the error of remarking on Momo, Kaminari had soon discovered that it was best to keep any offensive remarks about the female classmates to himself. He had the right idea that it was a bad idea to upset him after learning that Kenichi was not only her twin but also the one who aced the practical exam. Other students had arrived and were either sitting by themselves or conversing in various small groups. In the instance of Todoroki Shoto, he was sitting by himself and engaging in emotional brooding. Kenichi didn't realize that some students were still absent until Bakugo showed up and sat down rudely enough to draw Ida's attention. Aizawa-sensei should probably arrive with Midoriya and Uraraka. Since Kota Koji, the large man who could communicate with animals like Dr. Dolittle, was not present, Kenichi most likely replaced him. Unfortunately, Mineta Minoru, the great bastard, was present in the classroom, so this seemed more likely. Only a few minutes were needed for the short bastard to alienate every single girl in the classroom. When Kenichi heard his low mumblings about the girls in the class, it took a lot of willpower not to just punch the little shit through a wall. When the little shit mentioned Momo, it was particularly difficult. He occasionally lamented his hearing, which probably outperformed many of the most potent hearing-based quirks. Positively, he had gotten to know the class, shaken hands with nearly everyone, and learned about their quirks. Bakugo, Todoroki, and Mineta were the exceptions. Bakugo was also an asshole, and the first two were antisocial. He flatly refused to touch Mineta in the meantime. In any case, his quirk wasn't that great. What if his Spider-Man impression was enhanced by the ability to adhere to any surface? Not worthwhile. Either way, it made no difference. In any case, he couldn't possibly use so many quirks simultaneously. As of yet, he had not really integrated anything from any of their quirks. Even though he could lessen the horror of quirk singularity, he still had legitimate concerns about it. He kept their quirks in his mental data banks for the time being so he could review the specifics later and take the parts he wanted to keep forever. He would probably punch Todoroki and Bakugo in the face during a training session or the sports festival in order to obtain their genetic codes. He could be patient because he wasn't in a rush to obtain their data or anything. The door opened and Midoriya Izuku, a short child with wild green hair, appeared as Kenichi considered ways to punch the two in the face. Before Aizawa cut them off, he observed Midoriya, Ida, and Uraraka Ochako interacting. After the class had taken their seats, Aizawa took off his heavy yellow sleeping bag and said, "It took you all 8 seconds to settle down. Time is too precious to waste, you all aren't rational enough." He then showed the class a gym uniform and said, "Put on the gym uniforms in your desk and join me on the training grounds. You have 10 minutes. Aizawa left a classroom full of perplexed students without saying another word. Except for Kenichi, who had anticipated this. He reached for his gym attire, which consisted of a matching t-shirt and a somewhat fashionable pair of track pants. He arrived quickly and was changed in a matter of minutes because the locker rooms were close to the classroom. With super speed, it was incredible how fast one could complete tedious tasks like changing clothes. As most of the other boys entered the locker room, Kenichi was already on his way out. Aizawa grunted in acknowledgement as he entered the field, but said nothing else. The quiet was short-lived as more students began to show up after changing. Following everyone's arrival, Aizawa gave an explanation of the quirk assessment process. Following the resolution of the objections, Aizawa turned to Kenichi and said, "Yaoyorozu. Just call me Kenichi, it'll be less confusing." Aizawa gave a nod. Kenichi-san, you scored the highest for the practical exam. What was your best record for the softball pitch? The other students, who now knew that Kenichi had the record-breaking exam score, muttered in curiosity after hearing Aizawa's statement. Before responding, Kenichi gave it some thought. It wasn't something he had committed to memory. About 80 meters, give or take a meter. After tossing him a softball with a black band around it, Aizawa pointed to a circle on the ground and said, "Throw it as far as you can without leaving the circle." When Kenichi heard Bakugo growling in the background, he caught the ball and grinned a little. He chose to flaunt himself a little after entering the circle. As he started to change his right arm into his air cannon configuration, he kept the ball in his left hand. He positioned the softball over the opening in his palm and adjusted his fingers to secure it firmly. His arm began to swell like a balloon, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. As they watched the somewhat grotesque sight of Kenichi's arm expanding, the students made noises of shock and surprise. "I suggest everyone cover their ears." Kenichi turned to face the group and said, "If you have above-average hearing, please, for your own safety, ask my sister Momo for a pair of earplugs so I don't accidentally hurt you." He pointed to Momo with his left hand as his right continued to grow. The only person to ask Momo for earplugs was Jiro. Momo only needed to spend a few seconds creating a basic pair because it was one of her prepared items. She obviously needed to be able to protect her own ears if she was going to be throwing flashbangs. He proceeded to phase 2 after observing that Bakugo and Todoroki were being stubborn and that the majority of the class had followed his advice. He would simply quickly collapse his arm to fire a wave of pressurized air in a typical air cannon. But this time, the softball served as a cork. He was able to begin compressing his arm more forcefully and more slowly as a result. He pushed the air to compress further, causing his arm muscles to swell and twist. The shot would be more potent the more he compressed it. "Fire in the hole," he exclaimed when he was unable to further compress his arm. As soon as he let go of the softball, the pressurized air exploded from the hole in his palm, sending the ball past the speed of sound with a thunderous crack. In stunned silence, everyone watched as visible shockwaves rolled off the softball that was excelling so quickly. Jiro was overjoyed that Momo had given her the earplugs. As the explosive sound rang in Todoroki's and Bakugo's ears, they silently regretted not listening. Overall, it took him a little more than a minute to fire the softball, much of which was spent waiting for the other students to get ready. He turned to face Aizawa, who was examining the phone he was holding. Aizawa turned the phone around to show everyone the results while the entire class waited in silence until the alert went off. 4,284.9 million. At his score, even Kenichi whistled softly. He was pretty sure he would easily score more than a kilometer, but more than 4 was far beyond his expectations. "In order to improve, you need to know where you stand," Aizawa said to the class. The students anticipated excitement about using their quirks, Aizawa's threat of expulsion, the discussion of how unfair the world was, and other events followed. To be honest, Kenichi thought Aizawa was exhibiting some very negative characteristics for a teacher at this time. He bemoaned how unreasonable it was that the educational system was taking so long to use quirks for the physical assessments while expecting them to provide him with all the information he needed about his students' quirks. It was unreasonable. The physical examination revealed nothing useful regarding quirks that couldn't be utilized to enhance a person's physical capabilities. The fact that the tests were only physical had an impact on Jiro, Hagakure, and Kaminari in particular. Because of his height, he assumed Mineta too, but screw that guy. Even so, the quirks that improve physical characteristics have a significant advantage due to the test's solely physical nature. Yes, when used correctly, some quirks can be helpful and even help you do well on the tests. However, the end result is a wholly biased test in which he essentially threatened to expel the class's least physically fit member. Quirks was unrelated to it. If so, they would conduct tests intended for quirk usage rather than tests that were pre-existing quirks. Aizawa was a hypocrite for using an entirely out-of-date test and criticizing the education board for not permitting quirks to take a test that was created before quirks existed. Kenichi tried his best to avoid hypocrisy and to be reasonable when it mattered. Everyone knew that he was hypocritical in some ways. But he never punished people because of his hypocrisy. Even so, he might be harsh with them. He knew he wasn't perfect, but he didn't care. He simply gives it his all. However, he was not yet prepared to speak with Aizawa. At the conclusion of the tests, he intended to completely destroy the teacher. In order to achieve this, He returned to the class and engaged in conversation with the other students as Aizawa began assigning them to run the 50-meter dash in pairs. He went off to one side with Momo and most of the girls. "Yaoyorozu Kenichi, right? You related to Yaomomo here?" asked Ishido Mina, the pink-skinned, acid-spewing alien queen, who smiled brightly at him as he approached them. With a sly smile, Kenichi said, "Yeah, I'm her slightly older twin brother. Feel free to just call me Kenichi to make it less confusing." He was observing a slightly flushed Momo. Mina was beaming. "In that case, call me Mina. Your quirk looked kind of weird when you used it. What is it?" Kenichi laughed a little at his peculiar quirk. "It was really strange. I call my quirk biokinesis. I can modify my own genetic structure, and thus my entire body, as I see fit. So I can make myself stronger, faster, and so on at will. I can even do weird things like you saw where I turned my arm into a balloon. Or, he appeared to be a male Mina all of a sudden, saying, "I can do things like this." There was much surprise when he abruptly changed to having pink skin, pink curly hair, yellow horns, and golden eyes with black sclera. "That is so cool," Mina exclaimed, gazing up and down at Kenichi with stars in her eyes. "When I was younger, we thought my quirk was just shapeshifting. That was only a small part of it though. For now, he stayed away from the full extent of his quirk's power. He didn't want to overwhelm the other students or make them worry about all the different things he could do to them or to himself with their quirks. First, he would have to establish some sort of relationship with them. After that, he could begin assisting them in becoming stronger, just as he had done with Momo. Speaking of, he shifted back to his usual appearance and watched as she took her turn. Mina gave him a pout for it, but he chose to ignore it. Momo had positioned himself as a typical runner and awaited the signal. Her legs straightened with a power surge as soon as it went off, propelling her quickly down the track. She made huge 10-meter or so leaps instead of running down the track. She finished the race with a time of 3.52 seconds, which was only half a second slower than the speed-based Ida Tenya, who finished with 3.02 seconds. She had completed half a dozen leaps. Many people took notice of Momo's performance. She had stated that her quirk was creation, even though they hadn't been discussed in great detail. His name was called for his turn as she walked toward the group. He heard Mina say, "That was super impressive, Yaomomo." As he was leaving, Shiro Honta, the tape quirk user, was standing next to Kenichi. They exchanged courteous greetings and prepared themselves. Shiro positioned his elbows at the end of the track, while Kenichi started in the conventional manner. Shiro used both of his tape dispensers at the end of the track to reel himself forward far more quickly than he could have run when the signal went off. To be honest, Shiro's tape was quite impressive. However, it would be much more impressive and useful if it came from a less inconvenient location. In the meantime, Kenichi immediately accelerated and then decelerated at the finish line as the signal went off, causing a brief burst of air pressure. He moved at roughly 300 meters per second, giving himself a time of 0.15 seconds, but he didn't want to destroy the sound barrier for such a short distance. He saw Ida staring at him as he made his way back to the group of students who were all staring at him in disbelief. Ida appeared determined rather than upset. As he returned to his sister and the other girls, Kenichi nodded and smiled at Ida. Uraraka gazed at him in awe as he approached, asking, "Is there anything your quirk can't do?" "Sorry, we haven't met yet," Kenichi said with a small laugh as he extended his hand to her. Blushing, Uraraka shook his hand and said, "Uraraka Ochako, just call me Ochako." He grinned as he copied her genetic data from the embrace. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ochako-chan. As for my quirk, it's really adaptable and can be used to modify my body on the fly to match whatever situation I find myself in. Thanks to it I have an abundance of physical abilities. However, I am somewhat limited on my ranged options just using physical strength." As the testing went on, the conversation shifted to everyone's quirks. As he processed the details of Ochako's quirk, Kenichi couldn't help but smile. It was far more than she had anticipated, and if he had his way, he would use it in conjunction with a few others to give himself a significant boost in power soon. He was eagerly anticipating that. He wanted to meet Midoriya Inko, but how could he convince Midoriya to invite him over? As he watched Bakugo and Midoriya race, Kenichi thought about how he could get invited to meet Inko. He was interested in obtaining a duplicate of her quirk and contrasting it with Uraraka's. According to what he recalled, Inko's quirk was thought to be a weak gravity effect rather than telekinesis. This was primarily due to the fact that she needed to use several hand motions to move an object rather than simply summoning it, and the quirk's name, Attraction of Small Objects, appeared to be directed more at gravity than telekinesis. If it was a gravity-based quirk, he could create a much more potent gravity-based power using the knowledge from Uraraka's zero gravity and Inko's attraction of small objects. Uraraka didn't realize how powerful her quirk was, so he also needed to talk to her. In addition to eliminating the effects of gravity, it also eliminated the effects of momentum. If it hadn't, she wouldn't have been able to save Midoriya from falling by slapping him during the exams. Indeed, if only gravity had been removed, he would not have been able to accelerate any further, but the momentum he had already built up would have prevented him from falling at his current rate. He wanted to have as much access to gravity as possible because it was a natural force that could be used against almost anyone. In addition, he would be searching for quirks pertaining to the electromagnetic spectrum, peculiarities such as Kaminari's, about which he already knew. When combined with his remarkable melee strength and durability, projectiles fired from a railgun-like ability that had no pull from gravity sounded like a great ranged ability. They went on to the grip strength after the races were over. As they took turns, the male students in the class started to compete with one another. Although Midoriya received a score that was marginally above average, the Dupli Arms user Shoji Mezzo swiftly outperformed her. Zero yelled, 540. Are you a gorilla? No, more of an octopus. When he saw the readout showing 540 kilograms. Did someone say octopus? Hot. The entire class was staring at Mineta like he was a piece of scum after his comment. Even if they had given him a chance, that one statement would have made it obvious to everyone that he was a scumbag. It didn't matter if anyone agreed with him. Simply put, what he said was inappropriate to say aloud outside of a private residence. When Kenichi and Momo squeezed their readers so tightly that error messages appeared, everyone was taken aback. While Kenichi simply used physical strength, Momo practically crushed hers with a hydraulic press. Geez, you twins are both monsters in different ways. At Mina's remark, Momo flushed, but Kenichi simply gave her a thumbs up and a corny wink, saying, damn right. Both Midoriya's nervous expression and Bakugo's angry expression as he gave the twins a vicious glare were predictable. He was even more enraged than usual because he hadn't yet defeated either of them in an event, particularly since Deku is in the class. A few individuals were given the opportunity to demonstrate their leaping prowess in the standing long jump at the following event. Todoroki used an ice pillar to launch himself into the air. Bakugo propelled himself through the air with his explosions. Asui Suyu leapt high and far using her frog-like body. Much more successfully than he did during the race, Aoyama Yuga launched himself through the air using his naval laser. Speaking of Aoyama, he found it repulsive that Kenichi had shaken his hand. It was obviously not natural. He could only describe it as though the quirk had been pushed into him, secured with staples, and then covered with duct tape. Everything was incorrect. In order to properly integrate the quirk, he had already started modifying Aoyama's genetic makeup. Even though Aoyama was the traitor, and somewhat annoying of them, Kenichi couldn't bring himself to despise or even despise the man. He only had to consider the little bit of Midoriya's unusual life that he witnessed to realize that people would stop at nothing to avoid that prejudice and hatred. Unlike others, Aoyama genuinely desired to be a hero and ultimately made the right decision, which didn't hurt. Momo made gas-powered pistons that were strapped to her boots and supported her body when it was her turn to jump. She was propelled into the air and across the whole sand pit when they were fired. Since the longest pit was the highest score possible, there wasn't much incentive to go farther than clearing the pit. Nevertheless, her new friends erupted in excitement at her move. Everyone was watching Kenichi when he took the stage. When it was their turn, he and Momo attracted everyone's attention because they were the ones who were beaten. As he got closer to the jumping point, Kenichi gradually relaxed some of the constraints on his power and bounced a little. When he had had enough, he gave a little bunny hop that cleared the pit entirely and bounced on his ankles almost idly. Everyone watched in complete silence as Kenichi cleared the entire sand pit with a silly bunny hop, and then Mina yelled, "Oh come on. At least pretend you're trying." Mina and the others were grinning or giggling a little in spite of what she had said. Kenichi simply made a playful bow to the entire class. If the glare he was giving Kenichi was any indication, it was something that did not sit well with Aizawa. The next test, the continuous side steps, was the first in which neither Kenichi nor Momo placed first. Unfortunately, Mineta received that Kenichi was unable to match Mineta's quirk-amplified result, even with his strength and speed. With no effort on his part, the little bastard simply bounced between his bouncy balls after making mounds of them on either side. Seeing it, though, made Kenichi think. It made him think of that old film, Flubber. It was evident that Mineta was exerting more energy during his bounce than he was contributing. He would have to continuously hurl himself at the ball piles in order to bounce off of them if he wasn't. In the same way that a trampoline required constant jumping to function. You would eventually come to a stop if you stopped bouncing. After giving that some thought, Kenichi sighed silently and decided to touch Mineta in order to learn more about his quirk. Positively, like a certain arachnid-themed hero, he would also acquire an additional technique for adhering to surfaces. After finishing the side steps, the class returned to softball pitching, and everyone except Kenichi began throwing the ball. Unfortunately, he and his sister were unable to place first for the second time. Uraraka earned that distinction by merely throwing her ball into space and negating gravity. That ball was really never going to come back. It was Midoriya's turn after her. From the anime, not much appeared to have changed. In a last-ditch effort to win at least one event, Midoriya attempted to blow up his arm, but Aizawa stopped him. Sincerely, Kenichi felt that Midoriya lost his mind after being selected to succeed one for all. He used to use his intellect to gather information and formulate theories regarding quirks. In addition to his high-class grades, he demonstrated a functional mind in other small ways. However, he was searching for the most obvious way to accomplish a task using brute force. And he didn't have to. He wouldn't finish last without Aizawa manipulating the results, even if he did absolutely nothing with one for all. Mineta was doing terrible in everything but the side steps, where she excelled. He was at a significant disadvantage to the other students in the class because of his small stature and weakness. Mineta was 10 years old in stature and strength. Under All Might, Midoriya had worked non-stop for 10 months to gain strength. There was no way to compare the two. Mineta was being outperformed even by Jiro, who in these tests was essentially a typical teenage girl. So, yes, Midoriya was just going crazy and losing his mind because he had lost his mind at some point and turned into a meathead who wanted to use his fists to solve all of his problems. Without intervention, it was unlikely that he would use his brain once more until he damaged his hands and lost the ability to imitate All Might. Kenichi would make an effort to reach the fool, but he had little faith that it would succeed. He watched passively as Aizawa and the other students tore into Midoriya. When Aizawa's quirk was revealed, the majority of them appeared perplexed and shocked, but he was simply bored. At last, the famous moment occurred when Midoriya broke just one finger rather than his entire arm. Kenichi considered offering to fix it, but ultimately concluded that the idiot should endure the rest of the tests with it damaged. "What the hell was that, Deku? Explain now, you useless extra," he said, watching as Bakugo went completely insane and charged at Midoriya while exploding his quirk. After a brief moment, Aizawa explained the capture weapon and bemoaned his dry eye while Bakugo was wrapped in Aizawa's capture cloth and had his quirk disabled. "If you have such a problem with dry eye, why don't you have the support department whip up something for your goggles that missed your eyes for you?" Kenichi said, raising his voice loud enough for the entire class to hear. With a look of such utter horror, Aizawa slowly turned to face Kenichi, and for a moment, Kenichi wondered if he had said something really horrible. Aizawa finally broke eye contact and yelled, "Why didn't I ever think of that?" Kenichi simply shrugged and resumed ignoring the whole thing. A piece of shit like Bakugo would be banished prior to the sports festival if he had his way. When Momo's turn came, he was able to smile again. She made a rifle with a bore diameter that was marginally bigger than the softball and made a shell casing with a good amount of gunpowder for a custom round, rather than using a cannon to launch the ball. Finally, she turned the softball into a single, enormous round of ammunition by covering it with a round-pointed lead casing. As Momo used the rifle's powerful optic to take aim, the entire class appeared concerned. The softball was propelled by a 10-foot-long gout of flame that shot out of the barrel when she fired. 4,300.0 million. You just had to show me up, didn't you? Kenichi moaned before giving Momo a mocking glare. Momo said, "You have no one to blame but yourself, Oni-san," with a playful giggle as she made her way back to their small group. "What? How could this possibly be my fault?" Her grin widened. "Why, wasn't it you who taught me to carefully think about a problem and how to solve it while I had the time to do so? You're not supposed to use my amazing advice against me." Kenichi groaned playfully. Most of the girls laughed at what they were talking about. She was too preoccupied with worrying about Midoriya's broken finger, with the exception of Uraraka. She calling Midoriya Deku irritated him greatly. His irritation wasn't directed at her, but rather at the cowardly fool who allowed her to call him a moniker that tormented him for 10 years, mainly due to her cuteness. To put his past behind him and move on to the future, it would have been preferable to correct her and come up with a new name. They swiftly proceeded to the endurance run, the subsequent test. When it became evident that Kenichi, Momo, and Ida would run for hours, Aizawa had to finally put a stop to it. If Momo riding a solar-powered scooter could be considered running, that is. They then proceeded to the seated toe touch. Because they were generally more adaptable than the boys, the majority of the girls performed better. However, there were some exceptions. Ojiro, Shoji, and surprisingly a Todoroki all displayed their adaptability. But what shocked the students was witnessing Kenichi effortlessly bend in half. He could easily alter his body to become more flexible. In fact, his current level of flexibility was almost snake-like. Mina was the only other pupil to bend herself in half to that extent. However, she had to be able to flex and stretch because she was a dancer. Mina was much more flexible than Momo. Kenichi, however, wanted to blame Momo's breasts in part. They undoubtedly made the exercise a little more difficult because they were the biggest in the class. He gave the purple midget such a glare when he saw Mineta looking at the girls that the little bastard actually squeaked and fled behind Sato Rikido's bulky frame. The upper body test came last. For the next few minutes, perform a lot of ups, including sit-ups, push-ups, and pull-ups. Kenichi never gave up until Aizawa told him to stop so they could move on. It delighted him to hear the irritated frustration in Aizawa's voice, particularly because he could see how annoyed Aizawa was with him. Yaoyorozu Kenichi, tell me why you didn't take this seriously. You obviously held back and didn't put your all into the quirk apprehension test, Aizawa yelled as they completed the final exams. Carelessly, Kenichi replied, why would I need to? His words caused the pupils to gasp, but he kept going. Your irrational and hypocritical tests clearly only targeted a select few students within the class whose quirks didn't give them any physical edge. He looked at Jiro and Hagakure. Those two, for example, have amazing quirks, but your choice of using these tests puts them at a disadvantage. Honestly, you berate us like much younger children for not being rational enough because we took just a few seconds to settle down. Yet, you somehow feel it's rational to use a set of tests from the pre-quirk era to test quirks. Kenichi laughed as he said, either you're an irrational hypocrite or you're quirkist and attempting to find an excuse to expel students whose quirks aren't flashy enough. Either way, your threat doesn't have any bearing on me since I knew I'd score in the top 5, minimum, and therefore had nothing to fear from your threat. Unless, of course, you intend to add liar to the end of irrational hypocrite. As Kenichi concluded his brief speech, Aizawa gave him a glare. Most of the students stared at Kenichi in disbelief that he would respond to the teacher in this manner, particularly a teacher who, on a student's first day, threatened to expel them. She was staring proudly at Kenichi, with the exception of Momo. Knowing that she would at least place in the top 5, she hadn't felt threatened at all. She was completely certain that they would both be at the top of the class. Simply put, she was unaware of the test's bias against some students. As he struggled with his phone, Aizawa addressed the class, saying, I'm just going to display your aggregate scores. Explaining them in detail would take too long. He decided he couldn't really respond to Kenichi's brief tirade without giving it more ammunition. Momo Yaoyorozu, Kenichi Yaoyorozu, Shoto Todoroki, Katsuki Bakugo, Tenya Ida, ... Izuku Midoriya, Minoru Mineta. Oh, and as for expelling someone, that was just a rational deception. A hologram of their positions appeared, hovering in midair. Kenichi gave a loud snort. He attracted everyone's attention by saying, so you did decide to add liar to the list. Aizawa squinted and gave Kenichi another glare. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying a perilous edge. You might have been able to avoid a PR disaster, but what you did to your class last year is still a matter of public record. Principal Nezu must have had to do some fancy dancing to protect the school from a class action lawsuit after you expelled your entire class within the first week. He examined the list and noticed Mineta Minoru finishing last. And now you're lying about your threat to keep Mineta-san in the class. He's already ostracized himself from the rest of the class with his overwhelming perversion. Yet you're protecting him and turning yourself into a liar, for what? When he was done talking, he took a sharp look around. With the exception of Mineta and Midoriya, every student in the class was staring at Aizawa with disappointment. He looked back at Aizawa, who was quietly stewing with rage. I think I speak for most of the class when I say that I don't believe I can trust you to teach us properly. Your irrationality, hypocrisy, and lies today mean that we can no longer trust anything you say. We can no longer accept you as our teacher when we're trying to learn something so important. A teacher that leaves the classroom and has every student questioning if he told them the truth is a useless teacher. The remaining pupils agreed by nodding their heads. Most of them hadn't thought of it, but after Kenichi explained it to them, they realized how untrustworthy Aizawa truly was. A key component of learning was being able to trust your instructor. When you were training to be a hero, it was even more crucial. They had to be able to fully believe everything he said regarding their roles and responsibilities, or else they might unintentionally commit a crime because they were ignorant. Kenichi finished speaking and left the area without even waiting for Aizawa to respond. The other pupils who concurred with him quickly followed suit. He would have to go to Nezu's office later if he hadn't been summoned there first. He had never liked Aizawa's treatment of the students. Teachers shouldn't be feared by their students. They ought to show their teacher respect. Unless there was a significant change, he would use all of his power to impose the necessary changes because he didn't respect Aizawa. If he couldn't use that power when he needed it, what good was it to be born into one of the wealthiest and most influential political families in the nation? Undoubtedly, Kenichi was eager to speak with Nezu. Kenichi walked slowly back to the boys' changing area. He wanted to be certain that he would be available to fix any holes in the wall that Mineta might find. He was silently followed by the rest of the class. The boys could no longer remain silent as they divided along gender lines to go to the proper location. Kenichi-san, while I agree with what you said, was it really wise, or appropriate, to confront Aizawa-sensei in that manner? Ida strode directly up to Kenichi, gesturing with his arms in a robotic manner. Kenichi sighed as he took off his gym shirt. I have zero respect for Aizawa-sensei currently. His introduction to us was to berate us as if we were young children being loud. Then he proceeded to insult every student by calling us all irrational for taking 8 whole seconds to quiet down. Any other teacher would have been happy that their students were mature enough to settle down and pay attention in a handful of seconds. Yeah man, but aren't you scared you might get expelled for saying all that? Kenichi looked at Kaminari and said, not at all. If Aizawa-sensei dared to even attempt to expel me for that, he would be the one in deep trouble. Just think for a moment about what the fallout would be. I had a record-breaking score on the practical exam. The previous record holder, All Might himself. Even if that isn't an indication of my potential, there's my quirk and family to consider. Your family. Kenichi looked at Kirishima and said, I'm not bragging when I say my family is one of the wealthiest in the country. I'd prefer not to flaunt that, but it is what it is. That wealth means that we're very well connected to businesses and political entities. Despite how it likes to act, UA is still a public school and must adhere to government-mandated standards, including the standards and procedures for expelling students. If Aizawa-sensei had expelled me outside, I would have had one hell of a legal case against the school and him personally. I cannot be punished for telling the truth. He scowled as he looked at Mineta. Technically, if he had expelled you Mineta-san, it would have opened him up to not just the case I would have had, but also a discrimination lawsuit. He would have, essentially, been saying that your quirk, and therefore you, were not good enough for the school. That made everyone wince. One of the worst things about contemporary society was discrimination. The lawsuits that could result from it could be very ugly, and many people with mutant quirks had to deal with it on a regular basis. If the UA, the school's reputation would be immediately and permanently destroyed if a discrimination lawsuit had been brought against it. As the students changed, that thought caused silence. Mineta had not made any noise about discovering a hole in the wall by the time the boys had all finished changing. There were 3 possible explanations. Either it didn't exist, it hadn't yet, or Mineta was simply too anxious and depressed about the previous scare to try to look. Kenichi had taken a quick look around to see if he could spot anything obvious, but he wasn't prepared to investigate further and look everywhere in the room. The boys gathered the informational pamphlets about the subjects they would be studying that year and joined the girls in the class. They really ought to have attended the opening ceremony on the first day, which wasn't really a day for classes. They were to meet with the school counselor after that. Aizawa's order to skip that meeting probably prevented Mineta and Bakugo from being expelled right away for their attitudes. In an effort to form friendships, everyone took the time to get to know one another, their quirks, and other things. Except for Bakugo and Todoroki, who both ignored the rest of the class. As Kenichi watched Todoroki go, he made a self-promise to beat the living daylights out of Endeavor the first time he saw him. If only he could get away with it. He doesn't have to go and get a criminal record. Kenichi's gaze was drawn to the front of the classroom when Midoriya entered, appearing worn out and with his finger healed. Kenichi grinned to himself and walked cautiously up to the hesitant boy. He smiled as he approached Midoriya and held out his hand, saying, "Midoriya Izuku, right? Sorry if my rant against Aizawa-sensei delayed you in getting your finger treated. Honestly, the jerk should have sent you to the nurse right away instead of making you suffer through more testing in agony." "It's not your fault." Midoriya asked, looking nervous and jittery as he extended his hand to shake Kenichi's. As their hands touched, Kenichi opened his mouth to say his name. As soon as the terrible details of One for All flooded his mind, his stomach rebelled. Kenichi turned sideways instantly and started throwing up. His entire body trembled and his eyes watered in denial of what he had just gone through. "What the hell is wrong with your quirk? It's the most disgusting and vile thing I've ever experienced. It's like someone took the quirks of several people, butchered them, then put them together in bits and pieces using thread, tape, and safety pins to make some sort of eldritch horror. How are you even alive?" he exclaimed, losing all composure as he stared at Midoriya in utter horror over what he had felt. Before he staggered back and puked again, he practically shouted his final question. Kenichi had only intended to discreetly and courteously copy One for All in order to obtain examples of every quirk it contained. Shimura Nana, the predecessor of All Might, had given him Float, which he had particularly desired to obtain. As a child, who didn't want to be able to fly without assistance? He really wanted flight, but the other quirks were cool. However, he had encountered the monstrosity known as One for All the instant he had touched Midoriya. Kenichi's interpretation of another person's genetic information would be nearly impossible to convey to another person. He couldn't read the strings of code. It was more akin to a sensation or feeling. A bright spot that symbolized a person's quirk then appeared within that emotion. Branching tendrils emerged from that bright spot, touching and strengthening other pieces. Since the branching pieces resulted in improvements to the human body that made it possible for quirks to function without killing their users, he usually copied them. In his shock, Midoriya's quirk felt just as he had described. It only required a brief moment of reflection to realize why. The brother of All for One was One for All's original owner. According to the story, All for One forced the brother to have the original stockpiling quirk because it believed he was quirkless. This indicates that the first quirk to merge with the brother's original quirk was forcibly taken from someone and then forcefully thrust into the brother. He was able to transfer his power to another person, thereby combining it with his original quirk. Violence gave rise to One for All, and it still does. It took the quirk from the previous host and added it to itself each time it changed hosts. Given how violent and avaricious it was, it had to be the transfer quirk as well. They were brothers, so it made sense in a sick way that their quirks would be somewhat alike. Momo had rushed over to Kenichi as he was having trouble controlling his stomach and understanding the monstrosity of a quirk he had just imitated. "What did you do to him?" She glared at Midoriya after checking on him and holding his shoulders gently. Poor Midoriya was obviously freaking out and had no idea what was happening. In addition to saying some rather hurtful things about his quirk, Kenichi had clearly developed a violent illness. I didn't do anything. We just shook hands," he stammered out. As the secret was already out, Kenichi patted Momo's hand gently to get her attention and said, "He didn't do anything. It's my fault. When my quirk read his, I was caught completely off guard by how vile it was." "You read his quirk? What does that mean?" Kenichi, still shivering and pale, sighed as he turned to face Uraraka, who was standing beside Midoriya. "My quirk is biokinesis. It mostly only works on myself and lets me change my body and biology as I see fit. One of the small things I can do to other people is get a complete understanding of their genetic structure by touching them." He cleared his throat and coughed, spitting the last of the vomit onto the floor. In order to quickly clean up the mess, he would ask Momo to locate or make a mop and bucket. Mental damage was not improved by super regeneration. He said, "Part of that analysis is reading a person's quirk as well. I don't know more about someone's quirk, I just know it in a different way. It's also not something I can control. When I touch someone, I read them, every time." With his throat clear, his regeneration did heal the acid burns. He didn't feel the need to mention that he could alter his own genetic makeup to match someone else's and thus mimic their quirk because he knew them so well. Additionally, he wasn't overly concerned about disclosing the analysis section to the class. They had all probably encountered someone with an analysis quirk as kids and had just awakened their own quirk. Children, particularly those so young, lack the knowledge necessary to appropriately use or describe their quirks. People with analysis quirks were employed by numerous hospitals and institutions to monitor the children and record their quirks in their registry. Since they believed that older people would be better able to comprehend their own quirk than an outside observer, updating the registry was different. He grimaced and said, "I don't know what happened to you or your quirk, but there is something seriously wrong with it." He could see that shock and panic were fighting for control of Midoriya's face. "And it's definitely killing you, slowly. Momo, could you either find or make a mop and bucket? I'd like to clean up the mess I made," Kenichi said into the dead silence, his final statement forced upon the room. Only then did everyone realize there were mounds of vomit on the floor and promptly start to leave. Nobody wanted to stay in that classroom after the official meet and greet. Everyone left right away, leaving only the twins. Kenichi had no doubts whatsoever that Midoriya would pursue All Might. In any case, he would meet with the fool and, ideally, he would be able to heal the stupid blonde. Finding the cleaning supplies didn't take Momo long. Kenichi insisted on cleaning up the mess himself, even though she tried to do it for him. Was Midoriya-san's quirk really that bad? Momo couldn't help but wonder as he cleaned. Kenichi gave a nod and gazed directly into her. "You know what I can do with my quirk?" She nodded. She understood every detail as well as Kenichi was aware. "It's like someone did what I can do in the most brutal, painful, and disgusting way possible. It was completely unnatural and violent. Worse, I could feel that it was made up of at least 8 different people, only 7 of whom had quirks. It ripped those quirks out of them and kept it for itself. How Midoriya-san is alive with it writhing around inside of him is beyond me." And it was. Apart from meta-knowledge, the one-for-all sentiment was simply incorrect. Before continuing, it seemed to be tearing everything that was useful out of Midoriya. It was, in a sense. Midoriya's life force was gradually being eroded by one-for-all in order to strengthen itself. It had been doing so since the beginning, if he had to guess, and that was the source of its stored power. For those who had it before, it was their very way of life. It consumed their life force more quickly as it got stronger. None of them would have lived to old age if All for One hadn't killed them all too soon. All Might would have begun to wane by now, even if All for One hadn't been kicking the shit out of him. After all, the large lug was almost 50 years old. Kenichi would have to guess that Midoriya would exhibit symptoms before he was 40 years old. That does not include the potential for quirk singularity to interfere or the harm he will probably cause to himself. The stockpiling quirk alone would kill Midoriya before she turned 50. After that, it would kill the next wielder even more quickly. It will kill its host more quickly as it grows older and stronger. Only as they were putting away the cleaned cleaning supplies did the classroom door open, revealing an irate-looking Aizawa. After giving Kenichi a quick glance, he yelled, "Yaoyorozu Kenichi, Principal Nezu wants to see you in his office, now." With a nod, Kenichi turned to face his sister and said, "I'll meet you at the entrance." Momo acknowledged with a tilt of her head and gathered her belongings to head out. Kenichi discreetly trailed Aizawa to the principal's office. His lack of nervousness was evident, which seemed to irritate Aizawa even more. It was obvious that the verbal abuse earlier had irritated his teacher. Aizawa's failure to live up to his ideals was not his fault. Kenichi was not shocked to see Midoriya and All Might seated in Nezu's office when the door opened. He turned to Aizawa and said, "I thought I was here to get reamed out for reaming you out. What are those two doing here?" But he was unable to tell them that. Until they remembered who he was, some people were surprised by his lack of response to seeing All Might in person. He had encountered numerous well-known heroes, some of whom were even well-known abroad. For Kenichi, meeting All Might was just another Monday. Aizawa simply shrugged and walked out of the room. He had not received an invitation to the next meeting. After a few moments of silence, All Might coughed awkwardly and said, "Ah, Yaoyorozu Shonen, you're not here for whatever you seem to have said to Aizawa-kun." Kenichi turned to face All Might and arched an eyebrow, then said, "This is about your reaction to Midoriya Shonen's quirk." Kenichi gave a disgusted grimace. He was powerless to stop it. What about that abomination? Was an involuntary reaction to the disgusting feeling of one for all. That is what I mean, Yaoyorozu Shonen. As far as I know, Midoriya Shonen just has a strength-enhancing quirk that he can't quite control yet. Kenichi laughed. Then you don't know shit about his quirk. No offense, but you're not a quirkologist and I don't believe you've ever studied quirks in depth. Neither am I a quirkologist, but I am uniquely qualified to talk about someone's quirk after I touch them. First and foremost, his quirk's main function is not strength enhancement. It's being able to be passed from one person to another, like a transferable cancer. Everyone in the room had some reactions to that. Nezu was troubled by the language Kenichi had obviously chosen carefully. In an unusually solemn tone, he said, "Please, explain Kenichi-san." Kenichi grinned. "I'll try, but you have to understand that what I learned through my quirk can't be properly explained with words. I can come close, but there's still a lack of depth to the explanation." After everyone agreed, Kenichi began to explain. "As I said, the primary purpose of Midoriya-san's quirk is to be passed on to someone else. Its secondary function, what you believe to be simple strength enhancement, is actually a stockpiling quirk. Strength and power is just a side effect. It's what it's stockpiling that's disconcerting, life force. That sent a shock through the space. That's right, the stockpiling section of that vile thing slowly murders the person in possession of it. I estimate that Midoriya-san won't live to see 50. Less if he is subjected to too much physical stress, like more shattered limbs." He stared intently at Midoriya and made him cower slightly. "The more you hurt yourself, the faster you are literally killing yourself. The only way you can live to see your 50s is to pass that quirk onto someone else, except doing so would be tantamount to murder, just as deliberately giving someone a deadly incurable disease would be. Whoever gave you that quirk, has murdered you." Everyone was let down by that. He saw the sly looks that Nezu and Midoriya were giving All Might. He also failed to notice the guilty expression on All Might's face. "It was you that gave the quirk to Midoriya-san, wasn't it, All Might?" he said, using that as a rational justification. Nezu and All Might remained composed, but Midoriya's startled jump was a dead giveaway. All Might nodded slowly as he saw that the jig was up, saying, "I did." The room was suddenly filled with steam, which soon dissipated to reveal All Might's diminished form. "Side effect of giving it up?" Kenichi asked, raising an eyebrow. Lifting his shirt to reveal the terrible scar on the side of his chest, All Might shook his head and said, "No. This happened before I even met Midoriya Shonen. Around 6 years ago a vile villain injured me severely. Ever since then I've only been able to maintain my hero form for a few hours a day." Kenichi looked at All Might with a stern gaze toward Nezu. "I'm 100% sure that Recovery Girl spoke to you of my healing capabilities. I know she did because my schedule has some time set aside each week to learn from her. Is there a particular reason I wasn't asked to heal All Might back to full health sometime over the last few weeks?" An awkward silence fell between Nezu and All Might. Confused, Midoriya glanced around before concentrating on Kenichi. Why you could really heal All Might," he said in a low, obviously nervous voice to his fellow student. Kenichi glanced at Midoriya and nodded. "Easily, quickly, and with minimal effort. My quirk lets me replicate the tissue of others so I can even replace missing organs and lost limbs. Since it's their DNA, there's no chance of rejection." With uncontrollably wide eyes, Midoriya exclaimed, "That's amazing." Kenichi grinned, pleased that his quirk was valued. He said, "Thanks. Now if either of these two had bothered to contact me, I could have had All Might healed in an hour or two with minimal effort." This was a remnant of minor trauma from when his quirk was still only thought to be shapeshifting and not yet recognized as powerful. Yeah, we can get to that in a bit, Yaoyorozu Shonen. First, I think I should explain the history of Midoriya Shonen's quirk. As you guessed, I was the one who gave it to him. Its name is, said All Might, clearing his throat and having to wipe away some blood that was leaking. One for everyone. Kenichi listened to One for All's history as though he had never heard of it before. Even so, it was fun to be directly across from All Might as he concluded the tale by raising his hand and displaying an aurora of colors. For a while, the room was quiet while Kenichi digested what he had been told. Was what you said true? See, can you really heal All Might?" Izuku asked before Kenichi could respond. With a nod, Kenichi looked at Izuku and said, "Easily. I can heal you as well." Some were taken aback by that, asking, really?" Kenichi simply nodded. "It's a minor ability of my quirk. I can modify the genetics of anyone I touch. It's not as good as my personal modifications, which I can do instantly, but I can make changes to other people's genetic structure. Think of it like a retrovirus or something similar. I induce the change, but it will take months for the effects to appear fully. For example, if I tried to change your hair color, it would take time for the change to sweep through your system. Once it finished, the new hair color would begin to appear from your roots. So, rough guess, changing your hair color would take something like 6 months before you had enough to cut off the remaining green to show just the new. Izuku began to mutter as he used all the information he had learned to analyze Kenichi's quirk. It didn't bother Kenichi. Since it would be difficult to hide secrets from his classmates, he wasn't particularly secretive about his quirk. He was still irritated by his uncontrollable outburst. He simply didn't think One for All would feel so disgusting. Conversely, he now possessed the data on it and every last quirk that was contained within it. Glorious. 3 of One for All's quirks, a gear shift, Fa Jin, and Flota, were ideal for the way he had developed himself thus far. Even though he could only recall the name of Float, he was able to quickly identify the usefulness of the other 2. He was able to go from being very powerful to being stronger than All Might and Izuku in their primes combined, though, thanks to the stockpiling quirk. The stockpiling quick used life energy to increase its power, allowing Kenichi to generate enormous amounts of life energy without endangering himself. He could repeatedly force-feed the quirk more life energy in a year than all the previous users' lifetimes combined. He would start working on that as soon as he got home. But even with his skills, it would take time to accumulate enough power to make a big difference. The sooner he got going, the better. Izuku's gasp, "You can copy quirks. You can read people's genetics with a touch and even reproduce their cells with your own body to heal them. You can even modify your own genetics as you see fit, so you could, theoretically, touch someone and reproduce the genetic sequences necessary to copy their quirk." Startled him out of his reverie. Kenichi smiled and nodded, easily. Before anyone was able to protest, he continued, "There's a limit to how much power any one person can handle, though. It's a fringe theory known as quirk singularity. There's not much known about what happens to someone who passes the limit, but I know the limit exists. When I first realized my quirk could go farther than the original shapeshifting, I went a little crazy. Though I could have all the quirks I wanted, who wouldn't go a little power hungry?" Nezu and All Might both gave him worried looks in response to his remarks, but they remained silent since it seemed that Kenichi had moved past his brief moment of greed. Kenichi said, "I eventually reached a point where my whole body began to hurt. I was constantly fighting to keep my DNA from unraveling into something else. The pain and pressure only decreased when I removed a quirk. So, I removed most of them and had to think of something different." He looked between Nezu and All Might. "I don't know how aware you are of it, but every quirk does more than just the surface appearance. For example, anyone with any form of super strength has to have corresponding traits that improve everything about their body. After all, if you can lift 10 tons but have the leg bones of a normal person, you'd shatter your legs before you could even lift the weight. Imagine if someone like Death Arms caught a piece of falling debris only for his legs to shatter as the weight crushes everything but his super strong arms." Kenichi raised his arm and flexed it, causing muscles to contract and show off their definition. "So, I took those secondary traits and started splicing similar ones together to increase their effectiveness. Doing this gives my base body all the strength, speed, and durability of someone with related quirks, without actually having said quirks. This gives me the flexibility to pull out whatever quirk a situation calls for in the same way my sister Momo can pull out the right tool for the situation." Kenichi said, "When we shook hands, you mentioned my quirk looks like multiple quirks put together. What did you mean?" Izuku stared at him in wonder for a while before recalling what he had said. Kenichi gave Midoriya a dumbfounded look. It wasn't because he believed he was, but rather because anyone who was raised with a quirk knew you had to learn about it throughout your entire life. "I'd think it's obvious. One for All isn't just a single quirk. Hell, you should know that just from the story All Might told. It's obvious that it was at least 2 quirks, transfer and stockpile." He trailed off as it dawned on him that he had just increased his own value and danger. With the help of the transfer quirk, he was able to send complete copies of any quirk he was familiar with to anybody he desired without having to wait for his own quirk to rewrite their DNA. Without losing his own quirk, he could use his genetic control to grow a single hair with the genetic makeup of any quirk he desired and pass it on to whoever he desired. Yaoyorozu Shonen. Kenichi raised his eyebrows. "Sorry, I just thought of something horrifying and I'm about to repress it. Anyway," he returned his attention to Izuku, "since you have the quirk, it should be glaringly obvious to you that it contains a total of 8 quirks. There's obviously the transfer and stockpiling, plus the quirks of everyone that possessed one for all on top of their original quirk. He simply stared at Midoriya. If you were using it properly you'd at least feel something about them, I'm sure. His gaze narrowed slightly, but you're not. You're thinking of it like an on-off switch, aren't you? That's why you broke your finger throwing that stupid softball. It's a quirk. It's always on. Stop treating it like a transformation type. It's always there, always on, and part of every centimeter of your body. Kenichi hoped that this would encourage Midoriya to receive his full cowling sooner, even though he detested having to talk like he was working it out in real time. He had enjoyed Izuku throughout the series, despite his complaints about pre-training the character. Even though he took far too long and occasionally acted like an ignorant fool, he was still a far worse version of All Might in green. As Midoriya processed that information, Kenichi turned to face All Might and said, "Anyways, it seems we've gone fairly far afield. I'd like to get on with healing you and modifying Midoriya-san after I speak with Principal Nezu about Aizawa-sensei. You two should head down to Recovery Girl's office and have her prep a bed for All Might." The mention of his name caused Nezu to look up from his tea, but he said nothing. The fact that Toshinori had used his office for all of this actually irritated him a little. He had work to do, even though he wanted to be there. And Yaoyorozu-san wanted to be at the top of his game if he wanted to talk about his beliefs. It was now Aizawa's responsibility to save the lazy bum after he had dug himself a pretty big hole. Nezu and Kenichi faced each other across Nezu's desk as All Might, in his slender forma in which he preferred to be known as Toshinori Yaja, and Midoriya left the office. Nezu began by attempting to head things out. "Aizawa has informed me of what happened during his so-called quirk apprehension test. While I agree he did give your class a rather terrible impression, he is the only teacher available for your homeroom. All the other teachers have been assigned and none are free." After All Might and Midoriya had just left, Kenichi snorted, "That's a lie." He thumbed at the door and said, "All Might / Toshinori Yagi is not assigned to a class as the homeroom teacher." "True, but he is unable to," Nezu said, nodding. When he interrupted, Kenichi said, "He'll be available in a couple of hours, after I've healed him." And with that, Nezu suppressed a wince. Although he had hoped that Kenichi wouldn't bring that up, he had anticipated it and continued, saying, "While that is true, he lacks a crucial ability that Aizawa possesses that gives him the unique ability to teach such a volatile class." Kenichi laughed as he said, his ability to nullify quirks. "I understand that could be necessary with such powerhouses located in 1A. Nezu laughed as he replied, "But his presence is only required during quirk-related classes, not at any other time. Unless you're going to claim Aizawa-sensei will be sitting in on all of our classes." Kenichi continued before Nezu had a chance to respond, "And let's not forget the other way that Aizawa-sensei's failed apprehension test messed with the class. Thanks to his failures none of us had our scheduled meetings with the school counselor. I can easily point out 4 students in my class that I realized needed serious counseling after only knowing them for a few minutes. Possibly 2 who should have never been allowed into the school, let alone the hero classes. Then the fact that Aizawa-sensei lied to keep one of the 2 who should have never made it, especially one who clearly doesn't care about being a hero, and you can see why he has a negative reputation with the class." Nezu narrowed his eyes slightly and asked Kenichi, "Explain." Although it would have taken too long, Nezu had watched the video of the events. He hadn't watched every event, but he had skipped to the important part and seen that. Kenichi nodded. "Well, the one Aizawa-sensei saved was Minoru Mineta, the shortest boy in the class. Incidentally, he came in last simply due to his short stature being a hindrance in purely physical tests. Considering his stature he did fairly well, but it was his attitude that should instantly disqualify him as a hero. He's not here to become a hero at all. He's here to try and get laid, nothing more. From the very first moment I met him, he spouted nothing but perversions and looked at the female students in a very disturbing manner. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if he had a record for sexual harassment. Kenichi may despise the great bastard, but he wasn't going to crap on him about his abilities." Nezu nodded. "We check the records of every student before admitting them. We would never admit a student with any sort of criminal record." Snorting, "And no school would possibly cover up for a student's indiscretions if they believed he could get into UA. But you just proved my point. I'm willing to bet that Hound Dog could have sniffed out Minoru-san's perversion within moments. All of the girls in class did within minutes of meeting him, and all of them are uncomfortable in his presence. It's likely only a matter of time before he attempts to commit a crime against one, or more, of them. Nezu sighed. He couldn't argue with Kenichi because some schools did, in fact, conceal their bright students' criminal tendencies. The distinction of a student graduating from their school and then attending UA wasn't something they could ignore. They hoped that, like so many heroes before them, their alumni would support their school after they became heroes. In the end, it was all just greed. Nevertheless, Nezu's only response was, "You may be right. However, until he crosses a line there is little I can do." With a sigh, Kenichi nodded in comprehension. Nezu was somewhat by the books, but Aizawa might be a dick. Nevertheless, he was positive that Mineta would be fired after just one serious incident. Kenichi was just grinning. Still, we're off topic a bit again. We need a new homeroom teacher. Unless you can think of a way for Aizawa-sensei to earn back the trust of his students. Nezu was simply shaking his head. As entertaining as you thinking you have some say in the matter is, you don't. Aizawa will remain as your homeroom teacher. Kenichi simply gave Nezu a big smile and said, "Okay." After their talk was over, Kenichi got up, bowed courteously to Nezu, and left the office to head down to the clinic. Unlike Mineta, he did not despise Aizawa. All he wanted was for Aizawa to perform better. The pupils were entitled to a teacher who gave them his all. Aizawa didn't, not until after the USJ incident, anyway. After almost dying and only surviving because the students saved him, he had improved somewhat. It was likely that the USJ incident would still occur, but the result would be entirely different. No one would be in danger if Kenichi got his way. Given this, Aizawa would not alter as he had in the canonical series. Because of this, he was prepared to appear like a whiny brat if it made Aizawa angry and helped him behave differently. Either Kenichi would use politics to get him fired and replace him with a better teacher, or Aizawa would become irritated and change as a result of having his flaws pointed out to him. He was disgusted by Aizawa's treatment of his students on the first day, even though he knew he could do better. Once he learned his lesson, he wouldn't mind if Aizawa continued to be their teacher. To be honest, it felt like the entire school needed to be reminded that it was a school and not the teachers and Nezu's private property. Regretfully, it seemed that the USJ event would be the first incident he could utilize to further his agenda. As he reached the clinic door, he stopped thinking about such things. When he saw Recovery Girl and his two patients, he let himself in and grinned. "Good, I've been trying to convince the big lug to let you heal him since you showed me what you could do. It's about time he finally listened," she said, nodding approvingly when she saw him. "I will remain here to watch you carefully and keep an eye on Tonchinori-chan's vitals. You're obviously not a qualified doctor, so I have to remain on hand," she said, giving All Might a brief glare before turning back to Kenichi. Kenichi simply nodded in agreement with Recovery Girl's statement, perfectly reasonable. He said, "I'll start with All Might. Midoriya's issue isn't nearly as dire. He's got a good 30 or so years still." He turned to face Yagi Toshinori and Midoriya Izuku, who were both lying down on beds and connected to various monitoring devices. Kenichi approached All Might and touched the visible wound on his side. Recovery Girl had prepared him flawlessly, doing the work of a professional. Neither a light show nor any obvious indication that Kenichi was starting work were present. All Might, however, wriggled slightly as he sensed his internal organs realigning and filling in the gaps. "I can feel what's happening, Yaoyorozu Shonen," he said, his brilliant blue eyes fixed on Kenichi. Recovery Girl was nodding to herself and watching the equipment closely as it tracked All Might. It was to be expected that there were obvious signs of discomfort. However, she was taken aback by the lack of signs of pain. Blood started to pour out of All Might's mouth like a waterfall, and he grunted. "Don't mind that, I'm just purging excess blood from your organs, intestines, and the empty cavities where your stomach and lung are regrowing," Kenichi said, ignoring Midoriya's panic. All Might's missing parts were gradually growing back thanks to Kenichi, which gave him the time to examine his body thoroughly and start fixing the less damaged areas. There was a lot of wear and tear on the body of a nearly 50-year-old man who spent the majority of his adult life fighting crime. While he had the opportunity, Kenichi was fixing everything. At the same time, he was trying to strengthen All Might's muscles in a more conventional way. To work them out, he made and repaired micro tears in his muscles in a matter of months when a genetic modification would take months. All Might would be as ripped as his skinny body would allow him to be when he was finished. He would be quirkless All Might at his strongest. Until Kenichi had time to power a copy of the stockpiling quirk, at least, so he could later present it to All Might. After working non-stop for almost an hour, All Might appeared completely different when Kenichi moved away from him. The skeletal appearance had vanished. Any indication of the harm done to his body had vanished. Because of all the work Kenichi did to fix his body, he even appeared to be a few decades younger. He felt a surge of power in his muscles that had not been felt in years. The only reason his hair still looked a little bad was that it would take time to grow out and be replaced, or perhaps a nice trip to the salon. When everyone had finished analyzing All Might's altered appearance, they turned to Kenichi. With his almost glowing blue eyes, All Might fixed Kenichi with a piercing gaze and said, "Yaoyorozu Shonen. I don't know what to say to thank you." Kenichi continued to smirk. "Don't say anything yet, give me a week or two and I'll have you back to the full power of your prime." The room was completely silent. It was Midoriya who, amazingly, broke the hush that had fallen on the clinic following Kenichi's declaration, asking, But how? How can you make All Might that strong again?" "Because we shook hands. As disgusting as One for All feels to me, that doesn't mean I didn't get all of its information." Kenichi's black eyes flashed brightly as he smirked wickedly. "I know all 8 quirks that it holds. Specifically for All Might, I can recreate the transfer and stockpile quirks." "How did All Might transfer the quirk to you?" "I only know it requires a DNA transfer. He had me eat one of his hairs. So, see, can you really do that?" Kenichi laughed. "Easily. And using a hair makes sense. I can create a single hair follicle, maybe make it a brother, genetically speaking. Give it the combined transfer and stockpile quirks, then use my quirk to feed life force into it at an accelerated rate. Once it's powerful enough, I pluck the hair and give it to All Might. Boom. Prime power All Might." He looked at the shocked expression on All Might's face and laughed. "Seeing as how I did some maintenance on you, you should be able to feel a massive difference. I'd say you'll feel a good 20 or so years younger with the repair work I did. Ya know, lube up the joints, repair the cracks on the chassis, oil change, so on and so forth." His declaration prompted Recovery Girl to start examining All Might as thoroughly as possible without subjecting him to bulky, costly scanning devices. All Might got up at her insistence and started to flex and move his joints and body. His face was filled with awe as he experienced none of the aches and pains he had grown accustomed to. There were numerous minor aches and pains that he had accrued during his tenure as the top hero, but he never mentioned them. He had not anticipated having to cope with the debilitating arthritis that he knew would overtake the majority of his joints in the years to come. Everything felt wonderful and effortless, and he felt like he was 20 again. As All Might and Recovery Girl collaborated to establish a new baseline for his slender form, Kenichi approached Midoriya and said, "Your treatment is simpler and less taxing. I'm just going to introduce a change to your genetic structure that will offset the energy that One for All is taking from you. There will be a side effect though." With a nervous expression, Midoriya inquired, What kind of side effect?" "Nothing major, you're just going to have a much larger appetite. The energy has to come from somewhere, so I will be modifying your fat cells to be similar to myself and my sisters. You will be able to eat larger amounts of food and store the excess energy in your fat cells. One for All will then take that excess energy instead of robbing you of your own. This will also let it recover any energy you spend faster and increase its maximum output a bit faster too. That means you really need to start treating it as if it's always been a part of you." In Nezu's office, he wished to remind Midoriya of his counsel. He had half expected Midoriya to unlock his full cowling and go into a mumble storm at that precise moment. Midoriya lost his attention and started to mumble as he stood up, suggesting that his reminder had set off the memory. Standing back, Kenichi watched expectantly as Midoriya assumed a hoarse stance and started channeling One for All at the lowest threshold he was capable of. When Midoriya activated his quirk, the characteristic, red veins, appeared all over his body. As he advanced his quirk to a new level, green sparks started to appear all over his body once it was completely covered. When Midoriya started to spark, All Might and Recovery Girl turned to watch in astonishment. When All Might saw that Izuku had changed, he smiled proudly. "Knock that off. This is a clinic," Recovery Girl yelled as she struck Midoriya on the back of his head with her syringe-shaped cane. As Recovery Girl rapped his shin with her cane and said, "And you? Don't encourage him here, do it outside." Kenichi snickered, which was precisely the wrong thing to do. With an undignified yelp, Kenichi hopped around, clutching his bruised leg for a brief moment until his bruised shin was healed by his quick regeneration. Recovery Girl seemed to know that he would recover quickly, so she didn't feel the need to hold back when smacking him. "Sit back down and hold out your hand," he said, pointing to the bed behind Midoriya after lowering his leg. Midoriya obeyed, still rubbing his head. Kenichi grimaced and took his hand in his own. He was still repulsed by the way One for All was constructed. To control the visceral reaction, he had to concentrate on just breathing for a minute. After that, he concentrated on making the necessary modifications to Midoriya's body, just as he had done to Momo's. Designing the change was a little more challenging than inducing it. Before he caused the cascading change, Kenichi concentrated for a few minutes. He let go of Midoriya's hand and grinned. "It's begun. It will take some time, a couple of months at least, for the change to be complete. If you feel your appetite growing, eat. I've designed your change so that you will feel hungry as the amount of energy stored within your fat cells goes down. Once you fill up your reserves, you should only have to maintain them. You will also find yourself much hungrier after extended use of your quirk. Keep that in mind. It won't be crippling, but you will still feel it, especially if your reserves get low." With a startled expression, Midoriya examined his hand and said, "I didn't feel anything, Yaoyorozu-san. Call me Kenichi, it's less confusing when my sister is around. And you won't feel anything for at least a month, possibly 2. Don't forget that you have at least 6 other quirks to use along with the stockpiling quirk." He crossed his arms over his chest and said, "Right now it's like you're using the power source, but not the powers themselves. Every quirk you have will be amplified by the stockpiling quirk, so learning about it isn't bad, but it's not everything either." Midoriya nodded, understanding that calling a guy by his first name wasn't nearly as embarrassing as calling a girl. Midoriya took a notebook out of. "What can you tell me about the other quirks?" I asked, opening it to a blank page. "I can't give you their names or a complete list of how to use them, but I can tell you the basics at least. The first one has some control over velocity. It'll require some experimentation to learn the limits and full functions. I can tell that it has the potential to greatly boost your speed, and therefore power." For a while he allowed Midoriya to mumble and write. "The next quirk stores and releases kinetic energy. That combined with the first should offer a massive potential power boost. Again, I'm not 100% sure of the mechanics, so experimentation is needed," he said, ignoring the fact that All Might and Recovery Girl were observing them. He continued to mutter and write. "The next one is super straightforward. It's best described as a sixth sense for negative emotions. You'll be able to sense things like hostility, hatred, anxiety, basically any of the negative emotions. So yeah, simple. Next is a quirk that will let you form tendrils of energy that you can control. Their strength is based on your emotions. Unfortunately, it looks like anger is the emotion that makes them the strongest they can be. You'll need to be careful with it, but I can see it adding a lot of utility and mobility to your repertoire." Midoriya frowned, looking a little taken aback. Kenichi could see why. Midoriya was not particularly known for being angry. To be honest, he was currently a big ol' pushover. Izuku was largely responsible for developing his own backbone, but Kenichi intended to work hard to help him overcome it. He smirked as he looked at All Might and said, "Might be where all that steam around you comes from. Subconscious use of the quirk. Next is probably the simplest one. It just lets you generate smoke." Recovery Girl and All Might gave that a contemplative look. Since the smoke the quirk produced was purple rather than white, Kenichi knew that was a lie. "Lastly you have," he said. He was interrupted by All Might, who muttered loudly, "Float, the quirk of my predecessor, Shimura Nana." As he spoke about the woman who gave him One for All so long ago, All Might appeared grave and somewhat depressed. "That's right, it's basically the ability to fly, slowly," said Kenichi, nodding. "Combined with the stockpiled power of One for All, it is much faster than it was originally," said All Might, shaking his head. "I'm sure the same is true for all of the other quirks. But that's all I know of them." Kenichi nodded and grinned. It was mostly accurate. He only remembered his favorite quirks from the series, not every last detail. He expressed exactly how he felt about the quirks in One for All. He was excited as he considered what he could accomplish with the quirks, but feeling them did bring back memories of a few things. Massive power could be produced by combining the kinetic energy storing quirk, Fa Jin, and the velocity quirk, Gearshift. However, float was the most significant. He could fly now. He would be able to fulfill so many people's dreams. He was so excited he could hardly contain it. The sooner he left school, the sooner he could adjust and begin using his new abilities. His power and mobility were going to soar. Kenichi got up and grinned. Well, that's all I can do for now. He turned his attention to All Might and said, I'll get to work on making you a new highly charged stockpiling quirk, but, like I said, it'll take a few weeks for me to charge it up. This was after he had dealt with the 2 one-for-all users, past and present. You don't have to do that, truly, but thank you Yaoyorozu Shonen for everything you've done for me. All Might's smile was enormous as he suddenly grew larger, though there was a suspicious amount of moisture near his ocular orbits. He flexed his muscles, particularly around his torso, and said, I haven't felt this good in over half a decade. I even feel I can maintain my muscled form for most of the day now. He trailed off as his smile faded, though, it seems, I will still be limited for only a few hours of actually using the sparks that remain of One for All. Kenichi gave himself a nod. It didn't appear that fixing the damage would grant All Might greater access to his power, as he had hoped. It doesn't matter. Like I said, I'll be remaking at least part of One for All for you. His smirk turned evil, and he said, you're going to have to look for a second successor now. In all honesty, it made sense because Midoriya had been given One for All. Perhaps I shall look into the young man that Sir Night-Eye was so insistent on me meeting, All Might said, stroking his chin after a moment of surprise. Kenichi grinned to himself as he considered that a great replacement for All Might's second iteration of One for All would be Tagata Mirio. A second route, a new branch, to enable another strong hero to strive for peace. Absolutely, Mirio would make a fantastic second One for All user in the future because of his permeation quirk, which Kenichi really wanted a copy of, his already exceptional strength, and his heroic demeanor. The idea of Kenichi's actions leading to such a future made him feel strangely excited. Outwardly, he simply nodded, whatever you want, All Might. Just don't go passing it on days after you get it. With the maintenance I did you should be able to be a hero for another decade easy. That way you can properly train up both of your successors. With a blinding smile, All Might said, I don't even begin to know how to thank you Yaoyorozu Shonen. Thank me by remaining the symbol of peace for at least another 10 years and I'll consider us even, Kenichi said, simply waving him away. After chuckling heartily at that, All Might gave Kenichi a thumbs up and said, consider it done. Following that, there were only a few brief conversations regarding frequent trips to Recovery Girl so she could monitor All Might and Midoriya. As she lectured the two about what she expected of them, Kenichi said his goodbyes and departed. He saw his sister reading a thick book while seated in a beach chair under an umbrella as he got closer to the school entrance. When she finally saw him, she snapped the book shut, crossed her arms under her enormous bust, and shot him a blank stare that he knew was bad for him. He quickly raised his hands in surrender. I'm sorry Momo-chan, I had no idea I would be taking so long. I swear I just expected to be talking to Principal Nezu about Aizawa-sensei's actions and their consequences. Instead I got roped into a discussion about Midoriya's quirk and ended up having to heal a teacher. After all, Momo had been waiting for less than 2 hours, and she still appeared to be quite irritated. Explain, Kenichi-san, she demanded, maintaining her glare. Momo only addressed him by his name when she was angry, but why was san added at the end? Kenichi winced. She was furious. Please forgive me, Momo-chan. The poor sensei they asked me to heal was missing his stomach, half a lung, and several feet of his intestines. Not to mention all the scarring and other damage done to his body. It took me an hour alone to heal him up, Kenichi said as he swiftly ran the remaining distance between them and fell to his knees in a perfect dogenza. Momo's expression softened at once. Since she was naturally compassionate, learning that someone had suffered such severe injuries deeply affected her. It made her happy to know that the teacher had been healed by her amazing, albeit somewhat obnoxious, brother. Although she had been a little concerned about his abrupt quest for power, she was delighted to learn that he was prepared to use his quirk to heal someone who had been so severely wounded. Although he had changed in the past year, it was encouraging to see that his kindness remained. For a while, she allowed him to perspire while in the dogenza position. She was undoubtedly pleased that he was still a decent person, but that didn't mean he didn't have to endure some pain for keeping her waiting so long. She finally stood up from her chair and uncrossed her arms, saying, I suppose, as far as reasons go, healing someone is a good reason for being so late. When Kenichi dared to look up, he saw Momo staring down at him. With a serious expression and a concealed smile, she said, but you owe me one Oni-san. Just name it Momo-chan and if it's within my power I'll grant it. Kenichi said, smiling hesitantly at Momo. I'll tell you when we're home. Though a little taken aback, Kenichi nodded and stood up. It was either private or embarrassing if she didn't want to discuss it here. He didn't want to risk upsetting her even more by trying to force it out of her right now. They headed home after he assisted her in gathering the things she had prepared while she waited for him. When the twins got home, they put away their school supplies and headed for their small manor house's largest bathtub. "So what was it you wanted?" Kenichi asked Momo as they cleaned off the day's accumulated dirt. "I know how you feel about my quirk and I agree that it is amazing, but it still takes me time to make something that's not on my list of special items. I'd like to have something to fall back on in case I don't have time to make something," Momo said, pausing in her arm washing to look over her shoulder at him. Kenichi raised one eyebrow in question as he looked over his own shoulder. After turning away from her and giving it some thought, Kenichi nodded and grinned, saying, "I can do that for you. I've got a few options you can choose from." After cleaning himself, he entered the opulent tub and spent some time soaking in its warmth. Soon after, Momo joined him, and he moaned inwardly that she was his sister. A part of him had hoped to see her naked on numerous occasions, and he knew she was beautiful. Nonetheless, he was blasé copyright about it because she was his sister and not a potential object of desire. Nevertheless, he was relieved that they were safely at home and that none of the perverts in his class would be able to see his sister. She was not deserving of any of those plebeians. After she had settled into the slightly steaming water, he said, "I've collected a lot of quirks, so you're spoiled for choice. My personal recommendations are, Float, which would let you fly. Black Whip, which would let you create tendrils of energy to sling yourself around with. Hardening would let you increase your durability to weather blows. Air Step might be a good subtle one. It would let you create invisible platforms of air to step on and give yourself 3D maneuverability. You could even pass it off as just using your normal quirk. Just say you're expelling compressed gas from your feet. Hell, you could probably do that for real." He was just brainstorming aloud at this point. As he watched her brother figure out the best way to get what she wanted, Momo grinned. She hasn't been let down yet. Particularly as he continued, "Actually, if you can really do that, then I could give you the float quirk and you could combine float and your new technique to give yourself real flight in an emergency. In normal combat, float could be used to make the amount of gas you need to expel for propulsion significantly less since you won't be fighting gravity." He gazed expectantly at Momo, who raised her foot slightly in the clear water and giggled. She wrinkled her nose slightly as she concentrated on her desires. She already had the ability to create continuously, so it should be easy to apply that ability to producing a steady stream of gas. She also chose hydrogen, the most straightforward gas. She could concentrate on the amount and pressure because it was the first element, could be compressed, and required the least amount of mental effort. After a moment, her quirk came to life and a ferocious stream of bubbles erupted from the sole of her foot, causing her foot to glow. "Whoa," she exclaimed as the force of the expulsion forced her back against the bathtub wall. "Momo," Kenichi exclaimed, his eyes widening as he laughed with delight. Momo stopped the flow of hydrogen when she heard the excitement in his voice and turned her attention to her brother. "You can produce gases," he exclaimed, practically vibrating with excitement. Momo nodded, perplexed by the digression. "Yes. One of your quick items is a gas mask," he trailed off, his smile turning positively feral, which she thought was cute on him. Although she didn't fully understand what he meant, she nodded and knew he was heading somewhere. He delivered on his promise by saying, "You could easily produce any kind of gas you desire, including knockout gas, while protecting yourself and allies with gas masks. Granted, it would be much less effective when fighting in wide open areas, but if someone gets close you could just blast them in the face with the gas." When Momo's own brilliant mind took his idea and ran with it, her eyes widened. She could easily come up with a number of situations in which a melee fight could be swiftly and easily ended by simply pointing her hand at someone and blasting them in the face. She realized she could even create cover by releasing smoke, which would provide her with an additional line of defense. She would be protected from blindness while the opponent was by wearing a gas mask with thermal vision. They immediately started talking about all the different ways Momo could utilize this aspect of her quirk. The UA wouldn't be aware of the impact. The class's first actual day of classwork was the following day. Although the majority of it seemed more like a review to Kenichi, there was still enough novelty to keep him interested. It wasn't because Midnight, or Kayama-sensei as she was supposed to be called in class, taught modern hero art history that he particularly enjoyed it. The intricacies of how heroic fashion affected the public and vice versa were actually covered in class. It was fascinating because there was a lot of discussion about how hero costumes have changed over time. When he discovered that every book they would be reading was about heroes, his enthusiasm for contemporary literature died a terrible death. Though it was a bit excessive, he enjoyed heroes just as much as the next guy. What became of the classics? At least a century ago, heroes and their conflicts with villains dominated the new classics. It would get old quickly, but it would be kind of interesting. He remembered his previous life as an American, which made learning English much easier. He was fluent in speaking, writing, and reading it. Given the theatrics of Present Mike and Hizashi Sensei, that class was really annoying. Math was math, Nuff said. The anticipated questions from yesterday's revelation didn't come up until lunchtime. The pro-hero lunch rush had prepared a huge lunch that Kenichi had gathered and paid for. He could have fed half a dozen people with ease. When he sat next to Momo and their two enormous lunches blended into one enormous pile of food, it appeared even more absurd. Before he had even finished his first bite, a good number of classmates sat opposite Momo and with him. He and Momo were seated at the table with what appeared to be the majority of the class. Bakugo, Todoroki, Mineta, Ojiro, Sato, and surprisingly Aoyama are the exceptions. He had half expected that the man would be looking for information about his quirk. However, it appeared that Aoyama had been coerced into being a spy, so he might only be fulfilling the bare minimum of his duties. He intended to keep watching the man because there was no telling. Among the obviously inquisitive group of students, Mina was the first to say, "Wow. You two eat a lot, huh? Family trait." When Momo's eating habits were brought up, she blushed slightly, but Kenichi simply smiled and said, "Something like that. Both of our quirks require a large intake of calories to function at their peak power." As he had planned, that turned out to be Mina's ideal opening. She jumped right in and said, "Speaking of quirks, what, exactly, is yours?" None of us missed your strange reaction to shaking Midori's hand. Izuku blushed and stammered at Mina's nickname for him. "I believe I've explained this before, but for everyone's benefit I'll do so again to make sure everyone understands." Kenichi sighed and nodded. "I call my quirk biokinesis. It gives me absolute control over every aspect of my body and genetic code. For example," he said after noticing that everyone was nodding in agreement or paying closer attention to him. "I can do small things like this." The talons moved away after he numbed the nerves in his left hand. "I can also control my muscle strength, bone density, visual acuity, and so on. All at a genetic level, so any changes I make are permanent until I take them away. I can also completely shift my appearance to match anyone, though it helps if I've touched them." Everyone was fascinated by his account, so he continued, "When I touch someone, a minor aspect of my quirk lets me fully understand their genetic code. So if I touch someone I can completely shift into them. It also gives me some basic information on an individual's quirk." He raised his hand to Midoriya. "In the case of Midoriya-san's quirk, it was a rather unique and disturbing thing for me to experience. It completely threw me off, so I said some things I shouldn't have and definitely didn't mean." He probably shouldn't have said anything but meant every phrase. Now, this doesn't mean there's anything wrong with his quirk, it's just how I perceived it. I'm used to people who've had fully functioning quirks all their lives, but after talking to Midoriya-san I believe my disturbance with his quirk comes from its late awakening. That should divert the student's attention from his remarks and align with the narrative that All Might and Midoriya were attempting to promote. For the time being, anyway. Their story would have as many holes in it as a block of Swiss cheese once other quirks began to emerge. Another benefit of touching people and knowing their genetic code is that I can use that information to heal them, in a limited fashion. I don't technically heal, it's more like I replace the broken bits." "What do you mean by that, Yaoyorozu-san?" Ida asked, seemingly jumping on that, his arm waving robotically. Kenichi smiled at the serious pupil. "Call me Kenichi," he thought to himself, "that applies to all of you. It's much less confusing for myself and Momo that way." He returned his gaze to Ida. "It's simple really. I can't actually heal wounds. If you get a bruise, Recovery Girl could give you a quick kiss to heal it. Meanwhile, I couldn't do anything for you. However, if you were to say, lose a finger in an accident, I could regrow your finger for you and it'd be just like the original. Think of it almost like personalized cloning. I can regrow and replace broken or lost pieces. So I'm great at super serious injuries but crap at minor ones." That seemed to impress everyone. Jiro continued, "So, every time you touch someone you learn about their DNA or whatever and can then change into them, right? So, Doesn't that mean that if you changed into them you could use their quirk as well? After being taken aback by the question, everyone turned to watch Kenichi for his response. His weight was short, he nodded his head, yup. If I shape-shifted into Yujiro-san, I would be capable of using your quirk. However, I wouldn't be anywhere near as proficient with it. Just like you did, I would have to learn how to use it properly and I would need to train with it to make it stronger. At most, I would be able to use the basics of it without training. Any of your advanced moves or techniques would require training, not to mention any support gear that might be needed. He was entirely accurate in everything he said. It was clear that he needed to practice using the quirks he had copied. Due to his inability to control himself, he had experimented with float boosted by the stockpiling quirk last night. Before losing control and hurling himself into the ceiling, he had been able to slowly hover up a few inches. When he fell to the ground, he broke his wrist, fractured his skull, and broke 3 vertebrae. Without his regenerative powers, he would be in the hospital right now. After that, he obviously continued using the standard float quirk. For the time being. For a while, the group ate in silence while they processed the details he had shared about his quirk. In fact, Midoriya had taken out a notebook and was taking more notes regarding Kenichi's quirk. Fortunately, he said nothing about Kenichi's capacity to mimic and utilize people's quirks without first transforming into them. Before lunch ended and they returned to the classroom, they didn't discuss much more. They were all a little excited about today's heroics class, which was the first one. They heard thundering footsteps coming down the hall as they waited for their teacher to arrive. Then they all heard a familiar voice say, "It's me." "No way, it can't be," coming through the door like a normal person, exclaimed All Might in his muscular form as he threw open the door and threw himself into the classroom, eliciting many looks of excitement and surprise from the students. Because the average person was wearing a Silver Age hero costume and striking strong poses while an invisible wind ruffled their capes. The students were talking excitedly about his costume, his posing, and the fact that he didn't even enter the classroom normally. Foundational Hero Studies. Through this class we'll be building up your hero foundations through various trials. You also get a ton of credit for it, All Might said, continuing to change positions while addressing the class. He turned to face the class and produced a thick plastic card that read, "Battle." Let's jump right in with this. The Trial of Battle was written on it. The more combat-oriented students' hearts raced at that. To go along with your first battle there's also this, Bakugo said with a particularly excited expression. In other words, he took out a remote control and hit a button. Your costumes. We prepared your gear using the information you sent in to us to match your quirks. Was written as shelves slowly slid out of the wall to reveal numbered briefcases. Everyone became even more enthusiastic after that. Midoriya picked up his school bag and held it close, but he was the only one who did not pick up a briefcase. In all honesty, Kenichi felt that Midoriya's mother's costume was the most sentimental one he had worn during the entire series. Everyone go get changed and meet me at ground beta. Remember, everything you bring into the battlefield is vitally important. All Might disappeared in a haze after saying his last words. The students hurried to the changing room after gathering their costumes. Kenichi watched, and he wasn't shocked to see that everyone's outfits matched his recollection. He hadn't spent enough time with them to cause a stir that would alter their original attire. But he was certain that would change soon. His personal costume wasn't particularly noteworthy. He had on a pair of black, military-style BDUs that had been modified. The modifications were fashionable crisscrossing straps that hung low enough to swing beneath the thigh pockets and connected from the middle of his back to either side of his crotch. Additionally, the cloth was made to be resistant to blades. It was purely aesthetic, but a hero's outfit had to be fashionable. If not, he would have continued to use simple BDUs. Matte black leather boots with steel toes and thick rubber soles that extended past his ankles to the middle of his shins were tucked into his pants. He wore a black, sleeveless armored combat vest with a plain hood and numerous pockets on the front. On the back, it featured a highly stylized biohazard symbol that appeared to be composed of dark green DNA helixes. The symbol would be much more difficult to see in low light. He had a utility belt around his waist that held numerous hard flip-top containers full of various potentially useful items. Last but not least, a heavy face mask with air filtration, eye protection, and even a tiny air supply that would allow him to breathe in airless conditions for as long as 5 minutes was dangling from his utility belt in the center of his back. The mask's lower portion resembled a hideous mouth with teeth that resembled daggers. He grimaced as he looked at Mineta. What other people said didn't matter to him. Kenichi could not be persuaded that Mineta was not wearing a diaper by anyone, not even his beloved mother. It was a terrible design decision that would disturb everyone's initial perception of him as a hero. A first impression that would be difficult for anyone to forget. Kenichi decided to ignore the pervert and walk to the training ground beta entrance with the rest of the class. Kenichi gave his sister a quick glance and smiled widely. While maintaining her color scheme and providing her with all the bare skin required for her quirk, her current hero outfit was drastically different from her original design. She wore several outfits in place of a leotard. She wore a crop top with no back that was armored. It was secured to her shoulders and to the back of her shorts by a thin piece of fabric. She wore short shorts that exposed as much of her thighs as possible while still being long enough to avoid being indecent for the lower portion of her ensemble. Like Kenichi, she wore a utility belt around her waist that was stuffed with basic items that would be pointless to make or that would save time by avoiding the need to do so. She wore practical armored boots for her feet and armored pads for her knees and no heels for her. Last but not least, a thick, watch-like gadget that was a voice-activated computer was fastened to her left arm. She could use it to quickly retrieve any data she had saved on it, view it, and create an item. Like her original, the entire ensemble was red with white trimmings. She actually had more exposed skin without going overboard and flaunting a lot of cleavage, which was the outfit's greatest advantage. She still looked stunning in it, so she didn't lose any of her appeal while looking more put together, and they both thought the design was fantastic. All Might waited patiently for the students to join him at the training ground beta entrance. To be honest, he was feeling better than he had since the altercation with All For One that left him permanently disabled. He had the impression that he was in his prime at the age of 20. He no longer felt the aches and pains he had been experiencing. Meeting Yaoyorozu Shonen had been one of the significant life turning points that had lifted him out of the dark and back into the light, even though he believed he had been content and appreciative when he had found Midoriya Shonen. At least he could be in muscle form for his classes without worrying about using up all of his strength for the day, even though he could still only carry out his heroic duties for a few hours each day while using the embers of One For All. It was also convenient to be able to disguise myself somewhat by transforming into his slender form. It was nice to be able to go to the grocery store and find his favorite breakfast cereal without having to sign a dozen autographs, even though he loved his fans. He heard the students coming and glanced up at their costumes as soon as he heard them. Many of them were impressive, but perhaps not for the best reasons. He had reviewed the data they had on the students' quirks and observed how they performed on the practical tests. He therefore failed to see what use armor or a full suit could have for Aoyama Shonen. Jiro Shoujo and Kaminari Shonen appeared to be dressed in streetwear with a few small accoutrements for their quirks. Ojiro Shonen, meanwhile, was dressed simply in a white GI that had been slightly altered. The costume of Hagakure Shoujo was merely boots and gloves, and he didn't even want to think about what it might mean. His eyes swept over Bakugo Shonen, and he concealed a frown. Heroes who carried weapons made especially to inflict as much harm and damage as possible did not appeal to him. He was aware that accidents can result in fatalities or, worse, that sometimes taking a life is the only way to save more. Although it was unpleasant, it was the reality of the world, which he constantly tried to prevent from happening. But creating support equipment with the sole intent of causing harm, it made him uncomfortable. Regarding the remaining costumes, he had little more to say. However, Ashido Shoujo could have opted for a less visually appealing color palette and layout. At last, he looked at the two pupils who had transformed his life. He started by examining Yaoyorozu Shonen's attire and thought it was a little too militaristic for his taste and too dark given that it was primarily black. Maybe less emphasis on militarism and lighter hues. Finally, as his successor jogged out of the tunnel into the training ground, he looked at him. He was unable to fully suppress a snort of laughter despite his strong willpower. It was too obvious that he was paying tribute to himself. To conceal his amused snort, he covered his mouth and pretended to cough. He put his hands on his hips and grinned widely after everyone had assembled, saying, "I'm liking everyone's style. Very cool. Sensei, will we be having mock battles in the city like we did in the exam?" Ida asked, raising his hand quickly. All Might nodded. No, today we will be doing indoor urban combat. Villain activities that make the news most often are the ones visible in the public eye. However, this makes up a much smaller portion of criminal activity than you would expect. The truly dastardly ones hide their crimes from the light of justice by being indoors. Drug rings, weapons caches, fighting rings, and all kinds of criminal enterprises happen indoors. For this training session you will all be battling indoors as two-member hero and villain teams. At once, All Might was flooded with inquiries. He was unable to follow them all, but he winced inwardly when he heard Uraraka Shoujo inquire about the possibility of expulsion. Every lesson should not be a source of fear for kids or future heroes. The purpose of school was to teach, to provide a safe environment for learning from mistakes. The students were obviously scarred by the Aizawa incident. Every student ought to have faith that their teachers will act in their best interests. The manual says it exactly. Stop, I don't have super hearing. All Might cleared his throat and hurriedly produced a sheet of paper on which he had conveniently written the exercise's instructions. For this training mission, we will have a pair of heroes and villains. The villains have a nuclear device and are going to detonate it in 15 minutes unless their demands are met. The heroes must capture the villains or the device before the time limit expires. If the heroes manage to capture both villains or touch the nuclear device, they win. If the villains capture both heroes or time runs out, they win. Teams will be selected by lottery. After Midoriya responded to Ida's inquiry regarding the team selections, they promptly started drawing lots. With great skepticism that many, if any, teams would be the same as before, Kenichi watched with interest. Kenichi was happy to see that they had different pairs this time, even though he couldn't remember any teams other than the Midoriya vs. Bakugo match. They all quickly drew. Shiro Honta, Ashido Mina, and Team A. Ida Tenya and Uraraka Ochako, Team B. Hagakura Toru, Shoji Mezzo, and Team C. Aoyama Yuga, Midoriya Izuku, and Team D. Ojiro Mashirao, Hiroshima Eijiro, and Team E. Jiro Kyoka, Asui Suyu, and Team F. Todoroki Shoto, Tokiyami Fumikage, and Team G. Bakugo Katsuki, Mineta Minoru, and Team H. Yaoyorozu Kenichi, Kaminari Denki, and Team I. Yaoyorozu Momo, Sato Rikido, and Team J. Kenichi smiled to himself, thinking that it might be a little entertaining. However, since they drew close to last with just 2 matching letters remaining, he briefly believed that he and Momo would be on the same team. The fact that they hadn't made him happy and sad at the same time. Even though he wanted to collaborate with his sister, he understood that in order for her to grow, she needed to collaborate with others. Additionally, he felt a great deal of sympathy for the team she faced. Soon after Momo discovered she could produce gases, they were entering an enclosed urban environment. Only a handful of people he could imagine could possibly get past her. I hoped he wouldn't have to confront her. He waited calmly while the first matchup was decided. The first balls were drawn by All Might. Team D is the hero team, while Team H is the villain team. At that, Kenichi blinked. Despite the odds, it appeared that some things were simply meant to happen. Before the 4 students who would compete in the first round received their supplies and were sent out, the entire class was escorted to the observation room. The capture tape was a single roll of ordinary tape given to each student. Wrapping it around a member of the opposing team, however, would signify that they were captured and thus eliminated from the game. Additionally, each of them received a pair of earwigs that would enable them to converse with one another while only All Might could hear what was being said during the game. However, All Might's own earwig made it easy for anyone with keen hearing, like Jiro and Kenichi, to hear things. Everyone watched as Bakugo and Minoru entered the structure and discovered their nuclear bomb made of paper match. Hey, I'm going to cover the floor with my balls to trap anyone that comes in here. Minoru was clearly planning the use of his quirk, and everyone could see him scanning the room. Bakugo appeared to be thinking to himself and was not paying attention to Minoru. That shitty nerd Deku has a quirk, right? Was his question when he finally spoke to Minoru. Who? Minoru asked, turning to face Bakugo in utter confusion. Minoru hadn't given the boys in the class much thought, and since it was only their second day, he hadn't had time to commit many of their names to memory. He was completely lost because, even at that time, he couldn't remember anyone with a name even remotely similar to Deku. Bakugo turned to leave Minoru alone after clicking his tongue. Where are you going? Minoru asked Bakugo as he dashed to the doorway. To kill that shitty nerd. Bakugo was so furious with Deku that he was barely able to think. All he knew was that he was going to beat Deku into the ground with such force that he would never be able to get back up to stop him. Bakugo disappeared down the stairs toward the first floor, and Minoru watched him go. A little alarmed at being abandoned, Minoru rushed back into the room and started picking balls out of his head right away. He threw them all around the room to fill it with sticky mines. Anybody who touched one would be trapped right away. Aoyama and Midoriya were waiting outside for the mission to start in the meantime. Your quirk allows you to shoot a laser, right? Midoriya asked, glancing at his exercise partner. My glorious naval laser is both beautiful and effective, Aoyama said, nodding as he held out his cape in a dramatic pose as sparkles appeared all around him. Midoriya began to cough. Right, well, I mean Bakugo is definitely going to come after me himself. When we run into him, I want you to take off and find the bomb while I keep him distracted. I'm not completely certain what Minoru-san is capable of with his quirk, but I think you have range on him, so you should be able to take him on that way. I shall be victorious, Mon Ami. The last thing the villain shall see is my glory, Aoyama said, grabbing the ends of his cape and shaking it in a dramatic manner. With someone less flamboyant, Midoriya might have been able to devise a more practical plan, but he was not particularly familiar with Minoru's or Aoyama's quirks. Since Bakugo was his most likely opponent, it would have to do since he knew him the best. Hopefully, he could rely on Aoyama to perform his duties effectively. Back in the observation room, everyone silently observed the two teams getting ready. Simply put, until the matches started, there wasn't much to say. When the signal to start the first match was given, the group became enthusiastic. Kenichi kept a close eye on the monitors, listening in on the team's conversations. He was ready to make All Might arrest Bakugo if this battle turned out to be anything like canon. All Might would force the problem by calling the police himself if he failed as a teacher, as he currently does in canon. In the canon story, Bakugo committed attempted murder during his match against Midoriya and ought to have been arrested for it right away, regardless of what anyone said to the contrary. Forget about it. Sneaking into the building through one of the windows, Midoriya and Aoyama scanned their surroundings and listened carefully for any sign of their adversaries. Midoriya looked at Aoyama after neither of them heard anything, and he repeated, "Remember, when Bakugo comes after me, split off and locate Minoru-san while I keep him distracted." Aoyama grinned slightly and nodded, saying, They only had to go down a few hallways before a crazed Bakugo jumped around the closest corner. Found you, shitty Deku. Bakugo exploded with a powerful blast, barely allowing Midoriya to react by tackling his partner out of the way. Everyone could see after the smoke cleared that Midoriya had barely avoided the worst of the explosion and was missing half of his mask. His mask had been torn apart by the shockwave, but he had not been burned by the flames. After giving Aoyama a slight shove, Midoriya got up to confront Bakugo. Everyone could tell by the body language that there was drama between Bakugo and Midoriya, even though only 3 people could hear what was being said. Aoyama, meanwhile, was carrying out their strategy and had escaped to look for the bomb. The students watched as Midoriya and Bakugo engaged in combat, with Midoriya launching a flawless shoulder throw and forcefully slamming Bakugo into the ground. Although it wasn't nearly enough to stop Bakugo, judging by the murderous expression on his face, it undoubtedly made him even more irate. The two engaged in some verbal back and forth before Midoriya left to give Aoyama more time to locate the bomb. He had far too little confidence in his full cowling to attempt to use it against Bakugo. It was asking for trouble to use an unproven ability in a real-time combat scenario. It might not work, or worse, he might not be able to control it and Bakugo might get seriously injured. He didn't even want to think about how he might unintentionally kill Bakugo if he landed a full-powered blow, believing it would be weaker. All or nothing was still where he was at with One for All, and he knew he couldn't risk it. Instead of unintentionally killing or crippling someone, he would prefer to break every bone in his body. Bakugo soon discovered Midoriya hiding in a hallway, crouching down. Bakugo raised his left arm and pointed his gauntlet at Midoriya as the class watched, largely perplexed. As they both listened to Bakugo describe how his gauntlet operated, he looked over at Jiro and noticed that she was pale. Kenichi would concede that it was pretty awesome to use something to collect his extra nitroglycerin sweat for a much larger boom. But he also believed that in most hero work, it was practically worthless. It was only useful against opponents who were truly monstrous. Seeing the danger, All Might grabbed the small stick microphone that would allow him to say, "Bakugo Shonen, stop at once. You'll kill him," to all of the competing students. When they heard All Might, the entire class gasped in disbelief. If they had heard Bakugo's reply, "It won't kill him if he dodges," they would have been even more appalled. As Bakugo unleashed a truly enormous explosion of force and fire down the hallway, everyone watched in wide-eyed shock. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed multiple walls to the side, above, and below in addition to the wall behind Midoriya. Bakugo's attack destroyed multiple floors and left a huge hole in the structure. What the hell? This is just supposed to be a lesson. Midoriya shonen. Everyone could hardly see that Midoriya was still alive as the explosion's smoke and dust started to clear. The completely insane expression on Bakugo's face as he yelled at Midoriya through a cloud of smoke, however, was even more concerning. All Might Sensei, please put a stop to this. That Bakugo kid has gone mental, at this rate he'll kill him. Kirishima said, shocking Kenichi. No, what the fuck did you just say, All Might? Kenichi asked, unable to contain his rage. Everyone in the room turned to stare at Kenichi in disbelief. Momo, on the other hand, was so embarrassed that she covered her face with both hands. Kenichi didn't give All Might any time to respond. That's not your call. A student just tried to murder another student right in front of you. You're a goddamn hero and supposed to enforce the law. It's not even your goddamn decision. As a hero you swore to uphold the law, not ignore it whenever you feel like it. End this now and arrest that criminal or I'll do it myself. All Might looked at Kenichi thunderously, then his shoulders appeared to sag slightly. Returning his attention to the screens, he pushed a button that activated a loud horn. This exercise is over. All 4 of you report to the observation room, he said, grabbing the stick microphone as it was going off. All Might was adamant, saying, return now Bakugo shonen. This battle trial is over. If you attempt anything I will stop and restrain you myself. Despite the students' obvious surprise and the fact that Bakugo was shouting. Kenichi opened one of his hardened utility boxes and gave a nod of approval. He pulled his cell phone out from inside and opened it. He held it up to All Might after scrolling for a while and said, it doesn't look like you have a phone tucked away in your costume. Use mine to call the police. While the rest of the class stared in disbelief at what was happening, All Might glanced at the phone. They were on the verge of arresting one of their classmates for attempting to murder another. Even worse, All Might had refused to stop the situation, so a student had to threaten to turn the student in. They were all in shock because it was unthinkable. With so many people watching, All Might was unable to decline the phone. Additionally, he was able to see right through Kenichi and knew that the young man would do the same if he didn't. Kenichi nodded as he picked up the phone and said, good. There's video recording, audio recordings, and 18 eyewitnesses. He then turned to face the other students and said, you should all be prepared to give a statement on what you witnessed. Even though he didn't have a place to keep his phone and hadn't anticipated needing it, All Might accepted the call. He swiftly dialed a number from memory rather than the one Kenichi had keyed up. Naomasa, it's All Might. I need you to come down to Ua. There's been an incident. I'd like to keep it discreet, for now. There was a brief pause before All Might spoke again. Yeah, a student. It's pretty bad, right? I'll have all the evidence ready when you arrive. See you soon, my friend. Midoriya, Bakugo, Aoyama, and Minoru came in as All Might returned the phone to Kenichi. They all turned to face All Might, who was staring at Bakugo with a deadly serious expression on his face. Bakugo shonen, he said, pointing to a place off to the side where no one was standing. Please sit over there. Bakugo turned pale as he was singled out. He glanced around the room and saw expressions of disgust, contempt, and hatred mixed with looks of fear, which he would normally enjoy. He didn't say anything, but he stomped his way violently to the stop All Might indicated while everyone gave him plenty of space and moved aside. After Bakugo was seated, All Might said to the other pupils, we will continue while we await my friend Naomasa's arrival. He then swiftly removed 2 balls from the box and exclaimed, heroes, Team C. Villains, Team A. Kenichi glanced at Hagakure Toru and Shoji Mezzo, the hero duo. To be honest, they weren't a very good team. Hagakure had exceptional stealth, being invisible and all, while Shoji could scout with his additional eyes and ears. Shoji was very strong, but Hagakure didn't appear to be much of a fighter. Honta Siro and Ashido Mina were on the villains' side. On defense, those two. In fact, he pitied the heroes. The heroes would have their work cut out for them because Ashido could make the floor slick and Siro could set up tape traps for them to slide into. For their match, All Might guided the pupils to a different building. The last one had been damaged enough by Bakugo to be condemned. The cost of repairs would be enormous in the absence of someone like Cementos. All Might was not overly concerned about leaving Bakugo alone. He sensed that if the young man tried to flee, Kenichi would stop him. Of course, he was correct. The rest of the class obviously relaxed when All Might came back. The fact that Bakugo was feared by the entire class worried him. He couldn't blame them, though. It was obvious that the young man had gone too far. All Might had missed this line because he wanted Midoriya to move past his past. All Might was also remorseful for the incident. He was aware that pitting Bakugo and Midoriya against one another would only end badly. Nevertheless, he had done it in the hopes of allowing both young men to mature. Bakugo's life was now in ruins. With all the evidence against Bakugo, he couldn't see how he wouldn't be found guilty. There was no question in All Might's mind that he would be branded a villain and go to jail. If Bakugo was a model prisoner and demonstrated genuine regret to the courts, he could likely be released in 10 years. Even so, he would be permanently branded as a villain in Japan and would probably have to leave the nation in order to even obtain a low-wage, menial labor position. Knowing everything about All Might, Kenichi thought Bakugo deserved it. Bakugo anticipated that former classmates would come forward or be approached to add more evidence to the pile once his arrest made headlines. Bakugo could only have avoided jail time if there had been a significant injustice. In order to keep Bakugo from receiving a sentence that was less than the maximum, Kenichi intended to closely monitor the case and invest as much money as possible in it. Mina and Shiro examined the room in which their fictitious bomb was placed. With multiple pillars supporting the ceiling, it was rather open. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Mina asked her partner with a positively Cheshire smile. "I'll set up some fly traps. Once that's done you slick up the floor and we just wait for the little heroes to buzz on into the traps," Shiro said with a corresponding smile. All Might smiled a little at their laughter. At least they were feeling better. Shoji searched the area around Hagakure. Although he didn't say much, Hagakure didn't seem to be at ease with him just yet. He therefore took control. "Our opponents are a bad combination to go up against when they are on the defensive. We'll need to be extremely careful and aware of potential traps. Follow me carefully and if you see an opportunity take it." "Got it. For this mission I'm going full stealth." Hagakure's voice sounded out of thin air, and her gloves waved enthusiastically. With that, she hastily removed her boots and gloves. Shoji tried not to think about the fact that his exercise partner was running around in his undies. The horn that signaled the start of their match only a moment later sounded. The heroes entered the building as silently as they could. In an attempt to enhance his hearing, Shoji immediately started moving some of his limbs into extra ears. He noticed Hagakure's breathing right away. He then found Mina and Shiro's location very quickly. They weren't particularly attempting to be covert. Then Shoji made a mouth and positioned it near Hagakure's breathing, saying, "I've found them. They're on the second or third floor. We'll sneak closer so I can pinpoint them and observe before making a better plan." Shoji appeared to be by himself as the rest of the class watched him ascend the stairs to the second floor, pause, and then proceed to the third floor. He found Mina and Shiro quickly because they were talking without trying to quiet their voices. They believed they had this under control. Between each pillar, Shiro had stretched as much tape as he could manage in every possible direction, from the bottom to the top of his head. The floor was then liberally covered with Mina's weakest and most slick acid. Their opponents would swiftly fall into a tangle of tape and be apprehended if they made a single mistake. The door appeared to open on its own, and from the only safe place in the room of the Centera they could see Mina cheerfully waving and calling out something. Before Shoji reached into the room and used his hand to grab the top of the door to pull himself in without touching the floor, the two appeared to be quite arrogant. He fashioned more tentacles, turning them all into hands. Pulling himself up like a spider, his fingers dug into the walls. Everyone, including Mina and Shiro, stared in shock as Shoji scurried up the wall and out of Mina and Shiro's line of sight using his many hands and powerful strength. The two villains started to panic right away. They were protected by their defensive trap, but it also restricted their mobility. Although there was a lot of tape obstructing her path, Mina could skate on her own acid with ease. Shiro was a little less constrained. With his right elbow, he pointed the tape at the ceiling and let it fly. After it became stuck, he began to pull himself up higher and reel himself in, searching for Shoji's location. When Shoji turned to put his feet on a pillar, he was staring in the wrong direction. He launched himself through the air, using the pilar as a brace, and gave Shiro a forceful shove. Shiro was pushed away and trapped in a tangle of his own tape because he had nothing to protect himself. Shoji gave himself a makeshift set of wings that let him glide a little as he moved through the air by spreading his tentacles and enlarging the membrane between them. Mine did more than merely observe. She began swinging her arms toward Shoji as soon as she could see which way he was coming. Mild acid streams shot through the air toward him. She was careful to keep the acid at a level that would be slightly painful in the eyes and mildly irritating to the skin, but not as bad as the meanest of onions. Shoji lost his ability to glide and had to cover his eyes. Like Zero, he ended up entangled in a bunch of tape after coming in for a crash landing. All Might yelled, "Heroes win," as the group watched Mina laugh until the fictitious nuke behind her was clearly lifted off the ground. When the four teenagers returned to the observation room, the class was taken aback and congratulated Shoji and Hagakure on their unexpected victory. "Well done, all of you." All Might grinned broadly at them all and said, "Though, I believe you should explain to the rest of the students how you came to win." He turned to face the winning pair. Hagakure, this time wearing her costume, jumped as she raised her gloved hands. "Oh, it was brilliant. Shoji-kun was able to track the villains down pretty easily since they were making lots of noise. We didn't know what to expect, so when we got close he listened at the door for a bit. Then he asked me to open it since they weren't close and wouldn't be able to see me, so I could pull back easy. When he saw how the room was arranged, he explained the plan. He would go in as a distraction since he could climb easily and avoid the floor. While he had them distracted and focused on him, I was to slowly and carefully slide my way to the bomb. No one saw a thing while looking at Shoji-kun, so I got to the bomb easy." As the explanation filled in the blanks, everyone made small noises of recognition. Because of Shoji's large, ostentatious distraction and Hagakure's quirk, no one had noticed the small movements of the tape traps or the slide marks on the floor as she slipped around undetected. All Might congratulated the two, saying, "Very well done. A wonderful use of both of your skills." He looked at the other students and asked, "Can anyone tell me who the MVP of the trial was?" With a big, bright smile, Momo immediately raised her hand in the air and responded, "Shoji-san was the MVP. He not only found the opponents, but he came up with a valid plan that made excellent use of not only his own quirk but Hagakure-san's as well, then provided a distraction that managed to take down Honta-san. While Mina-san and Honta-san used their quirks in a logical manner, they failed to account for a way to give themselves some mobility. They may have built a trap that would catch many people, but they also locked themselves inside of it." While Momo stood proudly in front of the class's shocked expressions, All Might appeared a little taken aback. Kenichi appeared somewhat pleased with his younger sister. "Yes, well done. The MVP for this match is indeed Shoji Shonen." All Might spit into his hand. "Since the police had yet to show up, we had to move quickly. They weren't supposed to. Taking a little longer to get there wouldn't make a difference because it wasn't an emergency." The next matchup, Heroes, Team B, Villains, Team F, was chosen by All Might. Kenichi first glanced at Ida and Uraraka, the heroes, and then at Jiro and Asui, the villains. This was going to be another intriguing match, he couldn't help but think. Because of their quirks, Ida and Uraraka were both melee fighters. Uraraka needed to touch someone with all of her fingers in order to activate her quirk, whereas Ida primarily used speed-powered kicks. Asui was a more middle-range fighter who could engage in melee but also use her tongue to fight at a medium distance, while Jiro was a fairly committed ranged fighter who used her quirk in conjunction with speakers to launch sound wave attacks. After taking their equipment out of the observation room, the two teams were shown to another building. The mess Mina and Zero had created with their quirks would take far too long to clean up. Additionally, since the villains couldn't exploit anything that the previous two villains had left behind, it put the teams on an even playing field. The next match started shortly after All Might came back. There wasn't much Jiro and Asui could do to set up the area, so they would have an advantage. To direct their opponents where they desired, they did, however, relocate the bomb to a room with a single entrance. The subsequent match was disappointing. Ida was able to move at his maximum unburdened speed because Uraraka had relieved the weight of his armor. Ida won the match by charging through all of the villains' defenses and tagging the bomb once they knew which room they were in. Asui and Jiro had both attempted to stop him with attacks, but his speed prevented them from succeeding. He had a good start because they had chosen a room at the end of a hallway, and Uraraka had opened the door for him. Even though he didn't put forth much effort in such a brief battle, Ida was named the MVP when they returned. Kenichi turned to Jiro before the next match was decided, saying, Jiro-san, I can't help but wonder a couple of things. First, why not have the speakers on your legs on your arms instead? Or even as additional ones. It would give you the ability to aim your sound waves faster by not having to make sure you faced your opponents head on. I honestly hadn't thought of it, but that's a great idea. Thanks, Jiro said, gazing surprised at the remark and shrugging her earlobes. Kenichi gave a nod. My other question was, can you plug your jacks into something, like a music player, and hear the music? Before grabbing her own music player, pulling out the headphones, and jamming her earlobe into it, Jiro just stared blankly. Holy crap, why did I never think to try this before? She exclaimed, her eyes widening a few seconds later. Can you transfer the sound to your speakers? Was Kenichi's last question, and he smiled even more. Before she did so, Jiro's eyes widened in surprise once more. Through the speakers on her leg, the rock song she was listening to was audible to the entire class. Before she could continue, Kenichi nodded and said, "That's amazing. You should get a hardened music player and preload it with a bunch of emergency messages and instructions that you could amplify and pump out for people to hear. Heck, I bet you could even find ultrasonic or infrasonic sounds to do some interesting things with." Jiro stared at Kenichi, unable to speak. He had greatly expanded her quirk's potential and applications in a matter of minutes. A little overwhelmed, she nodded and said, "Thanks." While the rest of the class stared at Kenichi with admiration, Jiro immediately found a place to reflect on her quirk. Momo was grinning broadly and joyfully as she glanced between Jiro and Kenichi. She believed there was a special significance to the fact that he had only advised Jiro thus far. Although Kenichi enjoyed Jiro's persona, she was only the first pupil to whom he truly felt he could offer guidance. He left those students alone because the first match was so chaotic. He didn't really have any advice for the players regarding their quirks for the second match. Ida's was too direct to require guidance in the third. He would discuss Uraraka's with her later, and Asui's was also fairly straightforward and direct. To offer more guidance on the frog quirk, he would require additional information. Right, time to move on. Heroes, Team E, Villains, Team J, All Might exclaimed, clapping his hands together after finishing all of that. Good luck, Kenichi said, giving Momo a brief embrace. Ojiro Mashirao and Kirishima Eijiro were left outside while Momo and Sato Rikido were allowed inside by All Might. With a sigh, Kenichi shook his head and muttered, "I feel sorry for those guys." Midoriya asked, "Why?" From what I've seen, both Ojiro-san and Kirishima-san are strong melee fighters, the same as Sato-san. With Yaoyorozu-san helping him out, the two teams seems pretty evenly matched, maybe the villains a bit on the weaker side. Jiro and Midoriya both understood what he was saying. At first blush, maybe. You seem to be forgetting how versatile my little sister's quirk really is. Kenichi laughed and pointed to the screen where everyone was watching Momo create two gas masks with air tanks attached. You see, her quirk lets her make anything that's not alive. He turned back to Midoriya and said, in other words, if she was so inclined, she could make an entire human corpse, but she couldn't make a living person. She never would, but through that you can see that she can make more than just objects like hydraulic clamps. As the students turned away from Kenichi to watch the match, All Might signaled the start of the match. Since Ojiro and Kirishima's quirks didn't really have any practical applications, their only choice was to walk right in and start looking. They wanted to force one to prevail because they both excelled in face-to-face interactions. Now just think, if my sister could possibly, with enough study and effort, make an entire human being and all of the elements it's composed of, how hard would it be for her to simply flood a sealed room with any number of simple gases? Kenichi said again only after the two approached the villain team's location. Just as Ojiro and Kirishima rushed into the room, where a pair of villains wearing gas masks awaited them, everyone's eyes widened in realization. After saying something, Kirishima started laughing and giggling. For a few more steps into the room, Ojiro was able to maintain some composure before he started laughing too. Momo and Sato swiftly restrained the two after that. Momo had already made two more masks with oxygen tanks before All Might had finished announcing the winners, and Kenichi grinned and said, "Nitrous oxide, laughing gas." It was fairly obvious that Momo was the match's MVP when everyone got back, with Kirishima and Ojiro still occasionally laughing as they worked the gas out of their systems. Heroes, team, was said as All Might grabbed one of the final two balls to decide which team would be the heroes and which the villains. A few police officers entered the observation room as the door opened, with Principal Nezu standing on the shoulder of Detective Tsukauchi Naomasa. Nezu eyed All Might and said, "All Might, why wasn't I informed there would be a police presence at my school?" Before anyone else could respond, Nezu's voice had a distinct edge that made the hero shudder. I forgot in all the excitement." With a dangerous glint in his eyes, Nezu squinted at All Might and said, "Perhaps we should step outside with the good detective and you can explain yourself. I'm sure the other officers can keep an eye on your students for the next few minutes." The police and students sat in awkward silence. Even so, every student continued to cast angry, increasingly anxious glances in Bakugo's direction. Because of what transpired during his fight with Midoriya, everyone was aware that the police were supporting him. They all knew he was in serious trouble for what he had done, but no one spoke up. All Might, Naomasa, and Nezu were back in the room within a few minutes. Naomasa appeared somewhat dejected but largely resolute. Nezu's and All Might's faces were deliberately blank. "I've gotten a preliminary statement from All Might about the incident. He'll be providing audiovisual recordings as evidence. Get quick statements from the other students on the event. I'll question Midoriya-san, the victim," Naomasa said to his fellow officers, taking charge of the situation. The door opened again as he was finishing his sentence, and Aizawa-sensei entered the room. After receiving a few looks, he moved into the shadows and was swiftly ignored once more. To carry out their duties, Naomasa and the other officers divided up. Despite having been tasked with interviewing Midoriya, Naomasa approached Bakugo and said, "Bakugo Katsuki, please remove your mask and any support items that your costume contains, including your gauntlets. You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Midoriya Izuku." For a brief moment, Bakugo's face was expressionless before erupting into a fury. Every officer and pro-hero in the room turned to stare at him like a laser as he jumped to his feet. Spittle flying from his lips, Bakugo clenched his fists and screamed, "I didn't do anything wrong. It's just useless Deku. WHO gives a shit about that nerd." He looked at his hands and halted his tirade before it could continue. As he eliminated Bakugo's quirk, Kenichi glanced to the side and saw Aizawa, whose eyes were almost red. "All Might, please disarm and restrain Bakugo-san for me." Naomasa spoke quickly to his friend, turning to Aizawa with a serious expression. Despite letting out a bone-weary sigh, All Might did as Naomasa asked. Bakugo quickly lost all of his equipment and discovered that his arms were securely handcuffed behind his back. Bakugo, who was now almost catatonic, was gently touched and fell back into his seat, where he sat staring blankly. "Pebble," and "Quirkless Deku," were mumbled here and there. At the sight, Naomasa shook his head. Seeing a young man with such potential for success waste his entire life was heartbreaking. He promptly handed Bakugo over to Eraserhead and All Might. They would accompany the young man to the police station so that he could be questioned. Following that, they went over every statement they were gathering as well as the proof All Might and Nezu would be offering in the recordings. After gathering Midoriya, he steered him slightly to the side so he could give his statement. Kenichi was not surprised that Midoriya attempted to defend Bakugo but was unsuccessful. While Midoriya might sidestep or insist that, "He's not that bad," Naomasa was an excellent worker and wouldn't outright lie. The detective quickly learned every detail of the fight, including their previous exchanges. The detective was not at all pleased with the picture it quickly painted. Kenichi had to force himself not to laugh or smile when he heard Naomasa inquiring about the middle school Midoriya had attended with Bakugo. Naomasa would be able to track down the pupils from Midoriya's class and gather more proof with that small piece of information. Seeing the capable police officers performing their duties was very pleasant. Heroes may have given the impression that police were less, but Kenichi understood the office's importance and was very grateful for them. Kenichi's interview wasn't very long. A few easy questions to explain what happened. He could only explain what was on the recordings, so he wouldn't have to pretend to be an eyewitness, but he could bring up Bakugo's attempted assault the day before. It was another nail in Bakugo's coffin, but it also kind of put Aizawa under the bus for not reporting it or taking more action. By choosing not to stop the match, he also made an effort to avoid criticizing All Might. Even though he didn't agree with what All Might did, he respected the pro-hero and didn't want to do anything that could hurt him. He wasn't putting in the work to get him back to his best just to make people hate him. For Kenichi, it was an error brought on by his emotional attachment to Midoriya. It had to be dealt with, but not in the public eye where it might cause actual harm. Kenichi might see headlines like, All Might ignores attempted murder. Or something just as dramatic. He wanted no one else to pay for Bakugo's crimes. The police quickly completed collecting all of the students' statements. Although there were hints of potential follow-up interviews or court testimony, nobody was overly concerned. All Might clapped his hands to draw everyone's attention after the police left with a nearly catatonic Bakugo being led away in handcuffs, saying, Right, a small delay but we still have plenty of time for the last match. So, heroes, Team G. Which leaves Team I as the villains, he said, hastily retrieving the box to sketch the teams. As he glanced at their rivals, Todoroki and Tokiyami, Kenichi put a hand on Kaminari's shoulder. While Todoroki had a neutral expression and didn't appear to care at all, Tokiyami appeared interested in the match. They were swiftly guided by All Might to the designated building, where Kenichi and Kaminari kept their bomb. So, your quirk is all about electricity, right? Kenichi asked, glancing at Kaminari. Lifting his hand and letting yellow sparks of electricity fly around his fingers, Kaminari nodded and said, That's right. However, if I use too much I short-circuit my brain and become useless for a while. So, aside from the radio headgear, what other support items you got for your quirk? Kenichi asked, stroking his chin. Nothing. I'll just fry them in a single blast. Why? Kaminari asked, tilting his head in inquiry. Kenichi froze, then let out a moan. For a while, he had forgotten that Kaminari was a total moron. He fought by exerting as much force as he could and hoping to prevail. To pass the entrance exam, he must have struck it lucky and discovered a sizable collection of villain bots in total. Kenichi dismissed it and rummaged through his utility pouches until he discovered the malleable metallic wire he was searching for. He had asked for it to be used as a means of binding both big and powerful opponents. Instead of carrying around a dozen different sizes of cuffs, he could just wrap a spool of specialty wire around their wrists. Large opponents like Nomu or Muscular would need much stronger bindings, and a few dozen wire wraps would be 10 times stronger than any handcuffs. However, metal or plastic cuffs didn't usually matter. He reached for the spool and said, While I didn't specifically request it, this wire is conductive. If you can wrap someone up with a bit you should be able to zap them at range without having to go all out. You should seriously look into support gear that will let you fire aimed shots from range, man. Okay, so, you're like super strong, right? Kaminari asked, raising an eyebrow as he accepted the spool before shrugging and putting it in his pocket. Kenichi gave Kaminari a boring glance. By now, he had sufficiently described his quirk. Kaminari wasn't at fault if he didn't comprehend. He responded by saying, something like that. Look, they'll be coming soon. I doubt either of them are pushovers. Todoroki-san seems pretty cocky and has that ice quirk of his, so here's what I'm thinking. We should split up. I'll stay here to guard the bomb since I'm pretty sure Todoroki-san will do something big, like freeze the whole building, and then just stroll in like he owns the place. Meanwhile, if they do split up you can come from behind and take on Tokiyami-san. If they don't split up, you can let me know and we can pincer them. Sound good? Kaminari replied, sounds good. I'll find a spot on the first floor to hide and observe from. I'll let you know what they do. After Kenichi nodded, they parted ways. Kenichi was almost positive Todoroki would do the same thing in canon. The haughty, antisocial jerk had left yesterday and had not joined anyone for lunch today. This meant that he only knew about Kenichi's quirk from what he saw during Aizawa's quirk assessment test. That is, not very much. Kenichi reached behind his back and drew his mask forward as the starting horn sounded. He smirked as he glanced over the lower half of the grin, which appeared vicious and somewhat violent. He thought All Might was great, but at times he was overly idealistic. In a way, this was his own perverse homage to the eternally cheerful giant. Just as the temperature dropped and ice started to form on the ceiling, walls, and floors, he put on the mask. Ignoring the ice, Kenichi cracked his knuckles. It's time to wake Todoroki up for the first time. In order to meet and connect with heroes from around the globe, Kenichi and his family embarked on a world tour during the summer before UA classes began and following their entrance exam. Momo and Kenichi were supposed to behave like the ideal station kids. Although it was inconvenient, Kenichi was uniquely able to exploit this necessity of their lives. He listed all of the heroes' quirks and shook their hands. By cheerfully, even gleefully, meeting with any pro-hero, Kenichi also improved his family's reputation. He didn't care about quirks, their ranks, or anything else. He wanted to meet them if they were heroes. His family's popularity overseas was significantly increased by his welcoming and inclusive attitude toward them all. Even though Momo was aware that he was collecting quirks, it made his sister and parents very proud. All of this meant that Kenichi's quirks could be as strong as New Order from shaking hands with Star and Stripe, America's top hero, or as weak as glowing eyes from an unranked Canadian hero. He could make his eyes glow, bend reality itself to his will, and do a lot of other things. Kenichi believed the power of New Order was simply excessive in the case of Todoroki freezing the entire building in an attempt to trap and weaken him. But could he make his eyes shine so brightly that they were visible through the black ballistic plastic of his face mask? Practical. Rather than using New Order to disrupt reality, he used a different quirk from the Owl, a hero who was an expert at silent takedowns and urban operations. His quirk was fairly straightforward. It enabled him to darken a specific area around himself. Not complete darkness, but enough to significantly reduce fluorescent lights or render nighttime streetlights ineffective. With the help of night vision goggles, he was able to eliminate numerous criminals in the shadows. He didn't choose the name, quirk active, and the room he was in dimmed to the point where a person with normal human vision could hardly see. This highlighted his eyes' red glow even more and allowed the glow to highlight his mask's viscous grin, giving it a bloody appearance. He covered his head with his hood, which only deepened the shadow and added to the ominous appearance of the glow. In order to finish the picture, he needed to activate one final quirk, which he took from Steamworks, a charming British hero. A basic quirk that allows the user to control and manifest steam within a specified range. Any surface could be used to anchor the steam, and the user could adjust the steam's temperature from slightly cold to boiling. In order to release the warm steam into the chilly air, Kenichi turned on two tiny steam spots at the corner of his mouth on his mask. As a hero, you have to follow the cool rule. In addition, he wanted to make an impression because all the girls in the class were observing him at the moment. Even though he believed he had complete control over his hormones, they did a lot of his thinking for him. They really were that wicked. Line break. Todoroki strolled through the ice-covered structure with composure. Being certain that his opponents had been trapped and frozen solid, he was not in a hurry. His attitude wasn't entirely baseless. Yaoyorozu-san's other accomplishments were merely simple displays of strength, although he had demonstrated an amazing ability to launch the softball yesterday. The icy hot team doesn't think anything is particularly noteworthy. The small air cannon might be a little problematic, but in extremely cold temperatures, muscles struggled to function. Todoroki was certain that his opponents would be on the verge of frostbite by the time he got there, considering the attire that Yaoyorozu-san had been wearing. He didn't even see Kaminari as a danger to himself. He had to defrost a few doors before he could open them, and it took some time to look into rooms with closed doors. He knew something was amiss when he opened a frozen door on the third floor. Line break. The entire building froze, including Kaminari's feet, and he shuddered. Well, only his boots, not his feet. A tiny burst of his electricity was sufficient to shatter and melt his feet free because they were nice and thick. Additionally, he was relieved that he had left the room's door open because Todoroki's quirk had frozen solid due to its proximity to the epicenter. Looks like Kenichi-san was right. What a scary quirk, Kaminari muttered as he tightened his leather jacket around himself. He kept a close eye on the entrance, and soon Todoroki was pacing the hall without a glance in his direction. He waited a short while longer to see if Tokiyami would be trailing his teammate after he saw Todoroki depart. Kaminari made his decision when it appeared that Todoroki was by himself. The room's door could not be used as an escape route. The door would be very noisy to open due to the excess ice surrounding it, even if he were to unfreeze the hinges. He wasn't the most intelligent person, but he wasn't a total moron either. Making a lot of noise would only draw unwanted attention. Rather, he moved to the room's lone window. Using the heat energy produced by channeling his lightning, he ran his hands around the edges, melting the ice and allowing the window to open. He opened it slowly, and each time it squeaked, he winced. With a sigh of relief, he opened it all the way without anyone noticing. Looking out, he saw no one, so he tapped his earwig and said, "Hey partner, the ice dude is on his way up to you, but the Blackbird either took a different entrance, or can't take the cold and is outside. What's your plan?" Kaminari glanced out the window. "I've got a window for an exit. I'm going to slip out and circle the building to see if I can find the other guy. I think I can take him, if not I'll try to retreat and let you know. Any advice?" Tokiyami-san said his quirk was Dark Shadow, right? Kenichi asked after a brief period of silence. "Something like that, yeah. Well, If it's based on darkness and shadows, try making a bit of light with your quirk. It could be a good counter. Kaminari blinked at that. If he thought about it, it was pretty clear. Opposite elements were always light and dark in games and crap. Thanks. Let me know if Ice Guy shows. Seemed like a worthwhile endeavor. Will do. The line fell silent at that point, and Kaminari climbed out the window. He knelt down and saw that the path was clear when he looked to his left. He froze in place, turning to check his right, saying, "Oh, crap." Line break. Tokiyami was irritated. Todoroki had decided to take on their opponents by himself. The building's complete freezing was a very potent demonstration of his partner's quirk. But, literally, it left him in the cold. Although his costume wasn't particularly heavily layered, he wasn't as vulnerable to the cold as his bird-like countenance might indicate. His reactions would be slowed by the freezing temperatures, and navigating the now slick floors would be challenging. He had thus been reduced to the status of an observer. He was, at least, until he heard Kaminari's voice from the corner where he was standing. He glanced over and saw that a window halfway down the building's side was open. Kaminari was simply not very subtle, and he didn't have super hearing or anything, or silent while he talked. Opening his cloak and examining his stomach, Tokiyami grinned. After all, it appeared that he and Dark Shadow would be enjoying a feast of violence. He was spared a long wait. He turned the corner as soon as he heard Kaminari fall to the ground, and the Dark Shadow, shaped like a bird, emerged from his belly. He looked in the other direction, and Kaminari was in sight of both him and his quirk. Kaminari appeared shocked when he turned around and saw their magnificent dark face. Oh, crap. Line break. Shortly after ending the call with Kaminari, Kenichi watched the ice on his room's door melt. Outside, he could hear the sounds of fighting, but he didn't give it much thought. His entire attention was on the task at hand. If he could get past Kaminari in the first place, he would deal with Tokoyaki later. Since it was daylight outside and Kaminari could create light with his quirk, he was confident that he could extract something. The person at a disadvantage was Tokiyami. Kenichi leapt to his feet as his room's door opened. He had positioned himself to the side of the door, close enough to get to it in 2 bounds but far enough away that he wouldn't be in the crossfire if it were to open violently. Before Todoroki could even widen his eyes in shock and realize he could hear the sound of breaking ice, a fist struck the side of his face, knocking him off his feet. He fell to the ground on his side and slid across the floor, despite the special grip on his shoes that prevented him from slipping on the ice. Todoroki's head swam and he felt sick, as if he had just been struck by a sledgehammer. As the other boy stalked toward him, he slowly resisted seeing Kenichi. When he saw his opponent, his eyes grew wide and he experienced a brief, instinctive panic. Blood-covered fangs, brightly glowing red eyes, and breath so hot that steam swirled in the air from his mouth. For a moment, Todoroki stepped back in terror, wondering why he had ever lost his fear of the dark. Line break. Kaminari immediately launched his best attack when he saw Tokiyami standing in front of him along with a massive bird-shaped shadow with glowing yellow eyes. With the words, 1.3 million volt indiscriminate shock, he immediately increased his electricity as much as possible. As the lightning from Kaminari's quirk crawled up his body and rippled across the ground, Tokiyami would have loved to scream. Unfortunately, he had to endure the agony in silence because the voltage had locked his muscles firmly in place. However, Dark Shadow was not constrained by such human limitations, and as the brightly glowing lightning crawled all over his shadowy body, he screamed in agony. Tokiyami sagged slightly after the attack was over, but he resisted falling to the ground. He refused to fall in spite of the pain and smoke wisps all over his body. The majority of his focus was being consumed by barely being able to stop himself from doing so, so he exerted what little remaining effort to call out to his quirk, "Capture him, Dark Shadow. You got it. He's going down." Across the gap between them, the shadow creature swiftly seized Kaminari in his wing-like hands. The hell?" Dark Shadow exclaimed as he halted and turned to face Kaminari in his grasp. He withdrew to his partner and held out the short-circuited Kaminari, who continued to make happy noises as he was moved around, since it wasn't Dark Shadow's problem. After some effort, Tokiyami was able to secure Kaminari's capture by wrapping him in the capture tape he had. Over all the earwigs, All Might's voice said, "Kaminari Shonen is eliminated." Line break. As Kenichi learned of Kaminari's elimination, he suppressed a sigh. Although he hadn't witnessed the incident, he was able to deduce what had happened based on what he had heard. He had to concentrate on Todoroki at the moment. He had hoped that a quick blindside blow would knock the teenager out, but he was a little impressed to see that Todoroki was only rattled. He had to hold back on that blow because he didn't want to kill him or cause brain damage. He didn't dislike Todoroki or have any other reason to use such force. But that didn't mean he had to wait for him to get better. Just enough to know that he hadn't caused any immediate harm. Kenichi swiftly took out his capture tape and disappeared since Todoroki was moving. After a moment, Todoroki was securely bound. Todoroki Shonen is eliminated. Kenichi nodded to himself and glanced at Todoroki. In particular, he examined his pupil dilation and gazed into his eyes. Unaware of the slight trauma his disguise may have caused his classmate, he left the teenager on the ground to recover from the blow to his head because everything appeared to be normal. Was it possible that Kenichi could have caught Todoroki right away by using his speed? Indeed, he could have. Although it had a lower chance of sticking, it might have even conveyed the message Kenichi was attempting to convey. He needed someone to shake Todoroki's haughtiness, so he purposefully blindsided him. It was clear that Todoroki had the potential to be a fantastic hero. All he needed was a quick slap to knock the haughty person out. He needed someone to help him move past what his father had done to him after that. That should help things along nicely, especially since Kenichi started the arrogance beating early. He shut the room's door and moved aside to stand with his arms folded across his chest close to the center of the space. He should just stay in his current position as the antagonist in the scenario. It was his responsibility to protect the bomb, and he would do so even though he knew he could easily track down Tokiyami with his keen senses. Additionally, there was the benefit of forcing an opponent who might be hurt to use the energy necessary to approach him. Tokiyami had just a few minutes left before Kenichi won the match. Line break. Todoroki Shonen is eliminated. Tokiyami was a little taken aback by that unexpected revelation. Although he was aware of Kenichi-san's strength, he had assumed that even he would be defeated by the ice tomb Todoroki had created inside the structure. He moved away from Kaminari and peered through the building's front door through the fog that formed when the cold air touched the warmer outside air. The cold made him shudder, but he grew more determined. He would have to face Kenichi in his lair if he wanted to prevail in the one-on-one match. He looked at Dark Shadow floating close by. Maybe it was still a 2-on-1 battle. He entered the structure and made his way carefully, without slipping, to the stairs. Dark Shadow, shatter all the ice in our path. He realized that, going in quietly, was not an option when he saw the second-floor flight of stairs covered in ice. Hell yeah, Dark Shadow was far more powerful inside the building's shadowy interior than he had been in the sun. As he repeatedly punched the floor and broke the layer of ice, he laughed and cackled. Tokiyami began moving more quickly until he reached the 4th floor as Dark Shadow crushed and moved the slippery ice out of the way. It was simple for Tokiyami to remove those areas because Todoroki had not seen the need to close doors after inspecting the rooms. Before confronting Kenichi, Todoroki might have actually informed Tokiyami what room he was in if he had been a team player. As soon as Tokiyami saw the door closed, he said without hesitation, "Knock it down, Dark Shadow. The end draws near." Dark Shadow roared and used all of its strength to punch the door, sending it hurtling into the room. A moment later, there was a crash as Kenichi simply backhanded the door away. For the first time, Tokiyami and Dark Shadow saw Kenichi's dark face as they entered the still darkened room. The two glanced at the darkness, bloody-looking smile, and deep glowing eyes. Tokiyami was taken aback. A fellow being of the night perhaps. It matters not. Surrender, villain. Your time has come and such glorious darkness will only empower me further. To intimidate, Dark Shadow feigned cracking its knuckles. Watching, Kenichi simply smiled under his mask. He was confident that Tokiyami would value all of his hard work. What a dude. Kenichi's voice became deeper, darker, and scratchier as he said, "Ah, the second hero." He pointed nonchalantly to the location where Todoroki had chosen to remain. In a technical sense, Todoroki was free to depart after being eliminated. But he wouldn't do that. His goal was to see the trial through to its conclusion. He had to know why he had lost. As Kenichi followed him, a part of Tokiyami wanted to squeal with delight. He had few friends and struggled to connect with many people due to his appearance, dark desires, and speech pattern. He was thrilled about the possibility of making one more in his new class. With a loud crack of his knuckles, Kenichi raised his hands and said, "Don't hold back now, hero. Subdue him, Dark Shadow." Not only was Dark Shadow a very strong quirk, but it was also intelligent on its own. It was a very uncommon quality for quirks to possess. Tokiyami's quirk code was in Kenichi's possession, but it didn't explicitly tell him what gave it its sentience. He wanted to create a sentient quirk that would serve as a mental assistant, so it was frustrating. For now, though, he would continue to work on it. In response to Dark Shadow's charge, Kenichi heedlessly used a good deal of his strength to punch the energy being in the face. The Shadow Beast alone will not be enough to subdue me. Neither of you will be a match for me while working apart, said Dark Shadow as the blow sent him flying off to the side and out of his line of sight. Was Kenichi implying that Tokiyami could use the quirk to become tougher, faster, and stronger by merging with Dark Shadow? Indeed, he was. Winning this trial didn't matter to Kenichi. When he could use these classes and events to help the others get stronger faster, he didn't care about his grades. They would still need time to get better and stronger, but the sooner they learned, the more experience they would have with their skills. Kenichi was aware that, if he so desired, he could currently be the world's strongest single hero. It wasn't enough, even though it might make him famous. One hero was insufficient. He couldn't be everywhere at once. He couldn't keep everyone safe all the time. He wanted and needed allies and friends to fight alongside him against the impending darkness. By himself, he could likely manage all the head honchos. But what if he first had to battle through all of their henchmen, gradually losing strength? He could run out of energy because he only had so much at his disposal. All for One was not a fool and had plans within plans within plans, but it was difficult and would require work. Every advantage the good guys could get was vital. In light of that, what Kenichi was saying baffled Tokiyami. He always collaborated with Dark Shadow. After all, they were physically connected. Dark Shadow saw something that caused his eyes to enlarge and gave him a crazy thought as he recovered and charged at Kenichi again, only to be slapped away once more. Kenichi changed the color of his arms to a purple that matched Dark Shadow and appeared black in the dim light in order to give a stronger hint at Tokiyami's combined form. He used a weak illusion quirk to temporarily make his head appear somewhat bird-like, with a thick stream of steam billowing from the beak and still glowing red eyes. The tips of his fingers extended to become wicked claws. Come back, Dark Shadow. What? Why? I'll clobber this guy. Just get back here, Tokiyami exclaimed, blushing so much that it was almost impossible to see him. Dark Shadow complained, but followed orders. Tokiyami began whispering to him as he approached. Kenichi pretended not to hear, even though he could easily hear what was being said. He was not going to stop Tokiyami from doing exactly what he wanted. He hoped Tokiyami completed the task swiftly because they were running out of time. Shortly after, Dark Shadow encircled Tokiyami and started to move along his head and arms, so he wasn't let down. As Tokiyami gazed at Kenichi, the energy construct swiftly encircled him. When staring into the abyss, be sure that it shall stare back. Dark Abyss, the bird-headed teenager said. Time's up. Villains win.
So this was it for the series. I hope you enjoyed it. To watch more series like this, subscribe to my channel. Till then, bye bye.